Hey guys, tonight we slip on your boots and step straight into a Thanksgiving that smells like wood smoke, damp wool, and whatever the dog just dragged in from the yard. You're standing in the half-light of an early winter morning, and the world feels sharper back here, like the cold has teeth. The house breathes with little creaks and pops as the fire settles, and you can already tell this is not the kind of holiday where you sleep in. You probably won't survive this if your entire life skills include microwaving leftovers and asking your smart speaker to set a timer. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and your local time in the comments, because I like knowing where in the world you're listening from while you pretend you're not drifting off. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up in a farmhouse where the walls do not so much insulate as politely suggest the idea of warmth. The air inside is cold enough that your first breath feels like a little confession. Somewhere nearby, a kettle mutters over coals, and the faintest ribbon of steam rises like the house is sighing. The bed you crawl out of is not plush. It is practical. Straw, a thin mattress, quilts that smell faintly of soap and smoke, and a persistent draft that has clearly been paying rent longer than you have. Outside the window, the landscape is washed in grey and pale gold. If you are in New England, which is where Thanksgiving has the deepest roots in this era, the fields are mostly done giving. The corn is in, the squash is stored, the apple trees stand bare like they are waiting for a verdict. You see frost on the ground and you immediately understand why everyone is already moving. In a house like this, stillness is not restful. It is dangerous. The first sound you really notice is not music or laughter. It is labor. A thump of boots on the floorboards, the scrape of a chair, someone stirring ashes, coaxing last night's embers into something useful again. In 1826, Thanksgiving is not yet a guaranteed national holiday. That is the mainstream truth that slips in quietly, like the cold through the cracks. In many places, it depends on local custom and state proclamations, especially in New England, where governors often declare a day of thanksgiving and prayer after harvest. In other regions, families might mark the season with a feast whenever it suits the farm, the weather, and the church calendar. Historians still argue whether the early American Thanksgiving is mainly a religious observance that happens to include food, or a food-centered homecoming that happens to include prayer. Either way, you feel the weight of it in the room. This day matters, and not in a decorative way. You pull on your clothes, and there is no soft modern cotton hug. It is linen and wool and layers that itch just enough to remind you you are alive. Your feet meet the floor and you do a tiny, silent dance that says, "Yes, I am tough," while also saying, "Please, dear universe, why is the floor like this?" Joke number 1. Quietly, you suddenly miss the invention of central heating the way you miss a childhood pet. You head toward the hearth because the hearth is the real center of this universe. Not the table, not the front room, the hearth. The kitchen is not a separate, cozy zone with cute signs telling you to gather. It is a command post. The air smells like ash, yeast, and yesterday's onions. Hooks hang from beams. A few iron pots sit blackened and trustworthy. The kind of cookware that looks like it has survived arguments, winters, and possibly a minor war. The woman running this space, whether she is your mother, your aunt, your older sister, or the household's anchor by sheer competence, does not ask if you are hungry. She asks what you have done already, and you learn, very quickly, that Thanksgiving begins with fool. Wood first. Always wood first. You step out into the yard. and the cold grabs your cheeks like it is offended you even exist. The sky is brightening, and you can see your breath puff out in little ghosts. A stack of split logs waits under a lean-to, and you haul armfuls back toward the door. The work warms you in a blunt, honest way. Your shoulders complain. Your hands sting. You tell yourself it is festive inside. Someone is grinding something. Maybe cornmeal. Maybe spices if they are lucky enough to have them. Pepper and cinnamon are not casual pantry items for everyone in 1826. They are precious. If a bit of nutmeg shows up, it is treated like celebrity gossip. Joke number 2. You realize the nutmeg is basically the influencer of the spice world, and everyone is acting like it just arrived on horseback to bless the pudding. You notice the rhythm of the house. It is a series of small emergencies handled calmly. Water must be fetched. Bread dough must be watched like a living creature with moods. The fire must be kept steady, not too hot, not too low. And because there is no thermostat, no reliable oven dial, cooking is part skill and part negotiation with chaos. A brick oven, if the household has one, is heated by building a fire inside it, then raking out the coals and judging the temperature by feel, experience, and maybe a quick prayer. If they cook at the hearth, they use cranes, trammels, and iron spiders, shifting pots closer or farther from the flames like chess pieces. Your modern brain wants a timer. Their world wants judgment. Breakfast, if you get it, is simple. Maybe porridge. Maybe bread and butter if the butter is still good and not a salty brick of survival. Maybe applesauce. The feast is later. But you do not save room here. You eat because you will be working, and work burns calories the way the fire burns wood. As morning moves on, the house begins to fill with that particular holiday tension, excitement braided with pressure. Someone is coming. Cousins, neighbors, perhaps a minister, perhaps a family friend who traveled by wagon and will stay the night because travel after dark is no joke. Hospitality is not optional. It is reputation. You get sent to help with something you do not fully understand until you are doing it. Plucking a bird, maybe, or cleaning vegetables pulled from the root cellar, where the air is cold and earthy and smells like stored life. You wipe dirt from turnips. You brush sand from carrots. You handle onions and your eyes sting, and you wonder if crying count as being grateful. It does not, but it does keep your face moist in the dry winter air. So there is that. At some point you see the centerpiece candidate, and here is where the modern myth starts to wobble. Turkey is possible. Yes, especially in rural areas where people can raise them or hunt them. But it is not a guaranteed icon the way it becomes later. Some families serve goose. Some serve chicken. Some serve venison or pork. It depends on region, means, and what the farm can spare. You are here to feel the truth. Thanksgiving is not a single menu. It is a season of making do, dressed up in your best clothes. And you catch a quirky detail in the middle of all this practical noise. Feathers. They are everywhere if a bird is involved, floating and sticking to sleeves and hair. And someone saves the best quills because writing tools are not a casual purchase. A turkey feather can become the thing that signs a letter, records a debt, or copies a hymn. So even the mess has purpose. Nothing is just trash. You look at a feather clinging to your cuff and realize it is both annoying and valuable, which is basically the theme of 1826 in one tiny object. As the sun climbs, the scent of baking starts to thread through the rooms. Something sweet, if sugar is spared. Something rich. If the household has had a good year, you hear the scrape of a knife on wood, the clink of crockery, the soft, steady voice of someone counting, not money, but portions. Because the feast is about abundance. Yes, but abundance is relative. The pantry has to last through winter. The feast is a celebration, not a surrender. By late morning, you have a thin sheen of soot on your hands and the feeling that you have already lived an entire day. And still, nobody is lounging. The chairs remain mostly empty. The table is not dressed yet. The day is building, plank by plank, chore by chore, like a barn raising made of food. You glance toward the front room, where the best dishes might be waiting in a cupboard, and you can almost see the evening ahead. Prayer, noise, the clatter of serving, the little negotiations over who sits where. But for now, you are in the real Thanksgiving, the one that happens before the first bite, when gratitude is not a speech. It is a fire kept alive, a floor swept, a kettle filled, a home made ready. Joke number 3. Softly, as you carry another armful of wood. You finally understand why people back then did not need a fitness app. The house itself is the app, and it never lets you close it. You step back outside because the day is not interested in letting you linger by the fire. The light has sharpened. The frost crunches underfoot now, and there is a sense that the land itself is waiting to see what you are made of, Thanksgiving or not. Food does not appear by sentiment. It appears by effort. Hunting, trapping, and improvising are not rustic hobbies here. They are the reason dinner exists at all. If there is meat still needed for the table, you are part of the solution. A man hands you a tool without much ceremony. It might be a musket, heavy and awkward, smelling faintly of oil and old smoke. It might be a snare line to check, disappearing into brush you do not fully trust. If you are unlucky, it is both. The idea of going hunting in 1826 is not a leisurely walk followed by bragging rights. It is cold fingers, long waits, and the uncomfortable knowledge that coming back empty-handed means more than disappointment. It means adjustment. It means smaller portions. It means stretching something else thinner. You move through fields and edges of woods where the leaves are mostly down, exposing a tangle of branches and old growth. The quiet is thick, broken by the distant tap of an axe or the low call of someone coordinating work. You're told where to walk, where to stand, when to stop moving entirely. The discipline is practical. Animals are not impressed by your enthusiasm. They respond to stillness, patience, and luck. Here is the mainstream fact that hums beneath your breath, fogging the air. In the early 19th century, especially in rural America, families still rely heavily on wild game to supplement farmed food. Venison is common in some regions. Rabbits and squirrels are ordinary, not exotic. Wild turkey exists, yes, but it is wary and not always available when you want it. Historians still argue whether wild game was more symbolic or simply more necessary at Thanksgiving tables. But standing here, you do not feel symbolic. You feel cold, alert, and very aware of how loud your boots sound on frozen ground. When a shot finally cracks the air, it feels louder than you expect. Like the sound has teeth too. Smoke blooms and drifts. There is a pause that stretches just long enough for your mind to imagine failure. Then movement. Someone exhales. Success is not celebrated loudly. It is acknowledged with a nod and immediate work. The animal must be dealt with quickly, cleanly. You learn by watching and doing, hands numbing as you help, the smell metallic and unmistakable. This is PG-13 reality. Not gore, but it is not sanitized either. You understand deeply where meat comes from, and that understanding settles into you like weight. If hunting is not on the agenda, trapping might be. You follow a line of simple snares, checking each with the quiet hope that something has wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. When there is nothing, there is no anger. There is just recalculation. When there is something, there is efficiency. Joke number 1 sneaks in as you realize there is no such thing as catch and release when dinner is counting on you. Nature did not sign up for your ethics seminar back at the house. Improvisation continues. Someone is cleaning fish if the household is near a river or coast. Cod, haddock, or whatever the water has given recently. Fish often show up at early Thanksgiving meals, especially in New England, because they are reliable when weather and hunting are not. You watch scales flash in the light, hear the scrape of a knife, smell the sharp, clean scent of water life meeting air. It is brisk work, done with practiced hands. Inside, the kitchen adjusts to whatever arrives. This is where improvisation becomes art. A venison roast means one set of seasonings. Pork means another. A brace of rabbits means stew. A goose means careful fat management because goose fat is valuable, saved, and reused like liquid gold. Someone murmurs calculations out loud, not prices, but time. How long this will take to cook, how it will share space with bread, with pies, with whatever else the hearth can physically manage. You notice how little is wasted. Bones are set aside for stock. Fat is rendered. Scraps become something else tomorrow. This is the quirky tidbit that slips into your awareness. Thanksgiving leftovers in 1826 are not an afterthought. They are a strategy. Even the act of cooking is layered with future meals in mind. The feast is generous, but it is also precise. Joke number 2 drifts by as you realize the original meal prep influences are just called people who survive winter. As midday approaches, more people arrive. A wagon creaks into the yard. Boots stomp snow and mud off at the door. Greetings are warm but brief because hands are full and time is tight. Someone brings a contribution wrapped in cloth. A loaf. A crock of preserved something. A jug. You see how community feeds the table as much as the farm does. No one arrives empty-handed if they can help it, because that is how you prove you belong. Children dart around the edges of all this work, sometimes helpful, sometimes underfoot. They carry water. They are sent on errands. They sneak tastes when they think no one is looking. You catch one with a finger in something sweet and watch the exchange of looks that says, "I saw that," and also, "Fine, but don't get caught again." Joke number 3 lands softly there, because some things never change. No matter the century, the smells intensify. Meat roasting, bread baking, herbs crushed between fingers, releasing green, sharp notes into the air. Sage, thyme, whatever has survived drying. If sugar is used, it is measured carefully. Molasses might stand in where refined sugar is scarce or expensive. You taste a spoon and realize sweetness here is deeper, darker, less playful. It sticks to the tongue and feels earned. At some point, you are sent to wash up, not with a long, luxurious soak, but with cold water and soap that smells faintly of lye. You scrub your hands, noticing the little nicks and redness that come from real work. You smooth your hair, change into your better clothes if you have them, and feel that strange shift from laborer to guest, even though you know you will be back at work in minutes. The table begins to take shape. Boards dragged into place, a cloth spread, maybe plain, maybe carefully saved for days like this. Dishes emerge from cupboards, heavier and fewer than modern sets, chosen because they can survive heat, drops, and years of use. Each piece feels intentional. Nothing here is disposable. As the final hours before the meal approach, the energy tightens. The hearth is crowded with pots jockeying for position. Someone tastes and adjusts. Someone worries out loud. Someone else reassures them. Prayer is mentioned, not yet spoken, but hovering. This day has a spine of religion for many families, a sense that gratitude is not just emotion, but duty. Historians still argue how much that religious framing mattered compared to simple seasonal relief at having food stored. But in this room, it is braided together. Relief and reverence share the same breath. You take a moment near the door, looking out at the yard now marked with tracks, signs of arrival and effort. The light is lower, warmer. The cold is still there, but it feels held at bay by what is happening inside. You understand, in your bones, that this Thanksgiving is not about excess. It is about readiness, about having enough, about pulling together what the land, the hunt, and the community have provided and daring to call it a celebration. And as you step back toward the hearth, the noise, the heat, the smells wrapping around you, you feel the day tipping toward its center. The food is almost ready. The work is not done, but it has meaning now. You are not just feeding mouths. You are feeding winter itself, one careful, improvised meal at a time. You come back into the kitchen and immediately feel like you have walked into a living machine. It is heat, noise, motion, and sharp little decisions happening every few seconds. The hearth throws off a pulsing warmth, but it is not comforting warmth like a modern radiator. It is the kind of warmth that can cook your food or ruin your whole day, depending on how casually you treat it. The kitchen is a battleground, and the enemy is time, temperature, and human fatigue. The first thing you notice is soot. It lives here the way glitter lives in a craft room. No matter what you do, it will be on you. It will be in your sleeves, under your nails, probably on your face in a smear that makes you look heroic and slightly ridiculous. Someone will later point it out with the tone of a person who has too much to do to be impressed. You wipe your cheek anyway, because you are trying to look like you belong in this century. A big pot hangs over the fire on an iron crane, and the liquid inside shivers with little bubbles, sending up a smell that is rich and savory. Stock, maybe, made from bones and scraps, because nothing is wasted. Another pot sits closer to the coals, simmering slower, thickening into something that will become gravy or stew. A skillet rests on an iron spider, and fat crackles in it like tiny applause. You hear the slap of dough on a board, the rhythmic thud of kneading. You hear someone muttering measurements that are not really measurements. A pinch, a handful, enough. In 1826, recipes exist, sure, in cookbooks and handwritten family books. But in most homes, the real recipe is memory and muscle. Here is a mainstream fact that anchors the chaos. American home cooking in the early 19th century is largely hearth-based, with brick ovens or bake ovens used when available, and temperature control is done by experience rather than instruments. Thermometers for ovens are not a normal household tool. You are watching people cook by listening to the fire, watching the color of coals, feeling heat with a hand held near the mouth of an oven, judging readiness by smell and sound. It is part craft, part intuition, and part stubborn refusal to let dinner fail. And dinner can fail. That is what gives this kitchen its tension. You are not dealing with a backup pizza delivery plan. If the bread burns, you have fewer loaves. If the pie crust collapses, the dessert becomes a sad bowl of fruit and apology. If the roast dries out, you are chewing through disappointment. The stakes are not life and death, but they are dignity, comfort, and the precious sense that the year has gone well enough to celebrate. You get assigned a job. It is not a glamorous job because glamour is not on the schedule. You might be peeling vegetables by the bucket, your fingers stiff with cold and then suddenly warm from proximity to the fire. Or you might be tasked with basting a roast, leaning in close enough to feel your eyebrows consider resigning. Joke number 1 arrives the moment you realize your eyelashes are basically at toasting distance, and you make a mental note that you would like to keep them. If there is a bird, it is being managed with careful attention. If it is turkey, it is hefty, and it takes up space like a stubborn guest. If it is goose, it is fatty and needs watching so the fat can be saved, spooned off and kept. If it is pork, the skin is scored, the meat turned, the drippings prized. The cook is not simply making food. They are conducting heat. Every movement is strategic. A pot is lifted a little higher. A lid is cracked open to let steam escape. A pan is rotated because the fire is hotter on one side. You see how much of cooking is choreography. On the table by the window, there are jars and crocks, preserved things, pickles, dried apples, maybe cranberries if they are local, tart and bright. Though cranberry sauce as a gelatinous cylinder is not yet haunting anyone's dreams. If there is cranberry preparation, it is more likely a relish or a cooked sauce, sweetened if sugar can be spared. You catch a whiff of vinegar from something brined, and it cuts through the rich smells like a little wake-up slap. The meal needs contrast. They know that instinctively. Someone is working on bread, and you watch the dough rise in a bowl near the warmth, covered with cloth. Yeast in this period might be saved from brewing, or started from a Emptins-type ferment, depending on household habits. It is not the neat little packet you tear open today. It is alive, moody, sometimes unreliable. Historians still argue how widespread dependable commercial yeast became in American homes and when. But in this kitchen, the yeast is treated like a guest you cannot offend. It needs warmth, not too much. It needs time, not too much. It needs a gentle hand, not panic. The person tending it checks it like you might check a sleeping baby. The oven situation is its own drama. If the house has a brick oven, it has been heating for hours. A fire burned inside until the bricks held heat. Then the coals were raked out, the floor swept with a damp broom or rag. And now the cook is loading bread and pies, trying to make the most of the heat curve as it slowly declines. Bread first, perhaps, then pies as the oven cools. It is like surfing, but instead of waves, it is temperature. And instead of a wetsuit, you have wool sleeves and mild dread. And then there is the sugar problem. Not everyone has much of it. Refined white sugar exists, but it is expensive. Molasses is more common, and it brings a deep, almost smoky sweetness. Maple sugar might appear in some regions, especially in the Northeast, where families boil sap and store it in cakes or granules. Here is your quirky tidbit. Maple sugar often serves as a main sweetener in some households, and it changes everything. A pie sweetened with maple does not taste like modern pie. It tastes like trees and patience and springtime stored for November. You sample a little, and it is like tasting a secret the forest kept all year. You look for butter, and you find it. But it is not the soft, easily spread kind you keep in the fridge. It might be salted and firm, stored carefully because dairy is precious. If the family churned recently, the butter is a point of pride. If not, it is rationed. Either way, it is treated with respect. You see someone cut off a piece with a seriousness usually reserved for signing legal documents. The kitchen is crowded now, not just with people, but with sound. The scrape of chairs as someone reaches for something, the clink of a ladle against iron, the hiss when liquid hits hot fat. Every so often, someone calls out a question. Is it hot enough? How long since it went in? Did you add the salt? Answers come quick. Nobody has time for vague. Joke number 2 floats in as you realize this is basically a live kitchen show. Except the prize for losing is your family looking at you with quiet disappointment. Somewhere in the middle of all this, you see the social structure of the house revealed by who gets to command and who gets to obey. In some homes, women run the kitchen with unquestioned authority. In others, hired help or enslaved laborers do much of the work while the household presents the finished table as ours. The truth of that is complicated and uncomfortable, and you can feel it even if nobody names it out loud. Thanksgiving is often remembered as a wholesome tableau, but here, the labor behind it is visible. Historians still argue about how much the holiday narrative later smooths over these realities, but you are standing in the heat of it, and it cannot be smoothed. Your hands are busy. You carry water. You stir something thick and watch it change texture. You taste for seasoning. Salt is essential, but it is also a commodity. Pepper, if used, is used carefully. Herbs do the heavy lifting. You learn to trust smell as much as taste. When something is close to done, it smells different, like it is rounding a corner. The room shifts as the meal approaches. The cook's face tightens into focus. There is a moment where everything feels like it might tip into chaos, and then it steadies. Bread comes out, crust browned, sounding hollow when tapped. A pie is lifted and set to cool, its top bubbling. A roast is tested with a fork, juices running clear enough to relax someone's shoulders. The air becomes almost dizzying with scent. And then, suddenly, you're told to stop, not because the work is finished, but because the table is calling. Wash your hands, smooth your clothes, bring in the good plates. The kitchen, after all its heat and fight, is about to hand over its victory. You pause at the threshold, looking back at the soot-dark hearth, the iron pots, the flour on the table, the tired pride in the cook's posture. This is where Thanksgiving is made. Not in speeches, not in postcards, but in careful attention and stubborn effort. You take one last breath of that smoky, savory air and step toward the front room, where the day will finally become visible to everyone who did not have to wrestle with the fire. You step into the front room and the temperature drops like someone turned a dial labeled cozy down to honest. The kitchen is the warm heart of the house, but this space is where the family performs the idea of order. The table is set with the best the household owns, which might mean mismatched plates, a few pieces of cracked china saved for special days, pewter if they have it, or simple earthenware that looks sturdy enough to survive a small argument. A cloth is spread across the boards, and even if it is plain, it has been washed and saved and smoothed because this is one of the days you prove you're doing all right. And this is where your modern brain expects a certain lineup: turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie, the whole greatest hits album. But the actual table 200 years ago is less like a standardized playlist and more like somebody hit shuffle on the local harvest. Here is the mainstream fact you can almost taste before you even sit down. Around the 1820s, Thanksgiving in America is highly regional, and the classic menu is not yet locked in. New England households often feature roasted meats, root vegetables, breads, and pies. But what's present depends on what's been grown, preserved, or procured. Potatoes exist, sure, but mashed potatoes are not automatically the star. Cranberries appear in places where they are common and easy to gather. Pumpkin pie is known, but it is not a universal requirement. You realize the holiday is not a single recipe. It is a flexible ritual, shaped by geography and circumstance. The dishes begin arriving in waves, carried from the kitchen with that careful, two-handed grip that says, "If I drop this, I will emotionally move to another town." A roast comes first, steaming, glistening with fat. It could be turkey, yes, but it could just as easily be goose. or pork, or a cut of beef if the family has one to spare, or venison if hunting was good. Sometimes there are multiple meats, because abundance is the point, and if a family has had a strong year, they will show it. Then the sides. And this is where you start to see the real personality of the era. There are boiled vegetables, not in the modern sad cafeteria way, but in the practical winter prep way. Turnips, carrots, parsnips, cabbage, maybe onions cooked down until sweet, maybe a dish of squash, baked or stewed, seasoned simply because spices are precious. Corn shows up in some form, often as bread, cornbread, johnny cakes, or a more cake-like baked cornmeal dish depending on region and household habits. You spot something that looks like stuffing but isn't exactly the modern version. It might be a bread-based dressing baked separately rather than stuffed inside a bird, because managing temperatures safely is a different game, and ovens and hearth cooking don't always play nicely with the idea of cook the inside of this cavity thoroughly. It might be seasoned with sage, onions, and bits of meat or drippings, or it might not exist at all, replaced by something like dumplings or a thickened stew that does the same comfort work. And gravy. Yes, that is a bridge between centuries. People have always loved the idea of pouring flavor over everything. Gravy is made from drippings, thickened with flour, and treated like a sauce of unity. It makes the dry bits forgiving. It makes the simple bits feel special. It is the liquid handshake between meat and bread. Now for the surprise that quietly resets your expectations. Some of the most important dishes are not Thanksgiving dishes. They are everyday dishes elevated by volume and care. Beans might appear, baked long and slow. Apples are everywhere, not just in pie, but in sauces and preserves. Pickled vegetables cut the richness. A relish, a chutney-like mix, or even a simple vinegar pickle shows up to keep the meal from becoming a beige endurance event. The table might include a pudding, and not the modern little cup. Think boiled pudding, dense and warm, sometimes studded with dried fruit if the household has it. Suet might be involved. If you flinch at that word, congratulations, you're alive in the 21st century. Back here, fat is valuable. It is energy stored. It is winter insurance. Here is your quirky tidbit, served right alongside the roast. In some households, a dish called Indian pudding appears, made from cornmeal, milk, molasses, and spices if available, baked slowly until it becomes something between a custard and a cake. It is humble and rich at the same time, and it tells you something about how indigenous ingredients and colonial cooking blended in complicated ways. The name itself is a reminder that the era carries assumptions and labels that are messy and not always respectful by modern standards. The food is real. The history around it is not clean. You sit down and feel the table's social map. Elders get places of honor. The minister, if present, gets deference. Men and women might sit in certain patterns depending on family, region, and tradition. Children are placed where they can be watched. And you can almost see the invisible line between helpful and trouble. A child reaches for something too early and receives the kind of look that could curdle cream before anyone eats. There is prayer in many households, and it is not always the quick, polite version. It can be long. It can be earnest. It can include a miniature sermon, just in case you are worried your stomach might enjoy itself too much. Joke number 1. You realize the prayer length is directly proportional to how good the food smells, which is a cruel design choice by the universe. As the prayer ends, the room exhales and the meal begins. You pass dishes. You learn to take modest portions first, because going too big immediately is a social misstep. You can always take more. You cannot untake the judgment. and you feel the quiet satisfaction of eating food that required real coordination to exist. Bread that was guessed, not measured. Meat that was raised or hunted. Vegetables that were stored and guarded against spoilage. Each bite has a little echo of labor behind it. Historians still argue whether early Thanksgiving meals were primarily about celebrating harvest success or reinforcing community and religious identity. But you can feel both in the way people eat. There is joy, but it is disciplined. There is pleasure, but it is framed as gratitude, not indulgence. Even the laughter is careful at first, as if everyone is waiting to see if the day will go smoothly. Dessert is not yet here, but you can sense it waiting, like a second act. Someone mentions pies, and the room brightens. Pie is the promise. Pie is what turns a full stomach into a hopeful stomach. And you know, even before you see it, that it will not look like a magazine cover. It will look like something made by hands that have been working since dawn. You chew slowly, letting the flavors settle. You taste the region in it, the season in it, the household's luck in it, and you realize the real menu of Thanksgiving 200 years ago is not a checklist. It is a portrait of what the land gave, what the family saved, what the community shared, and what the fire allowed. You sit there with a plate that keeps getting refilled like the table has decided you are its personal project. And somewhere in the back of your modern mind, a little voice keeps chanting, "Turkey, turkey, turkey." Because you have been trained, like a very polite dog, to believe Thanksgiving equals turkey. But 200 years ago, the bird is more like a strong candidate than an elected official. Sometimes it wins. Sometimes it absolutely does not. You glance down the table and play a quiet game of spot the centerpiece. If there is a turkey, it arrives like a big, browned trophy. Legs splayed, skin taut and crackling. People nod at it the way they nod at a successful harvest. But if there is no turkey, nobody faints. Nobody calls the police. Nobody says, "Well, I guess we'll cancel gratitude." They just carve whatever is there, because the meal is about plenty, not branding. Here is the mainstream historical fact that keeps your expectations honest. In the early 1800s, turkey is associated with festive meals in some regions, but it is not universally standard for Thanksgiving. Choices vary widely based on local availability and household means. In some places, goose is considered more traditional. In others, pork is the dependable celebratory meat. In coastal regions, fish and shellfish might play a bigger role. Out on the frontier, venison can be the star because it is what the woods offer. Turkey is present in the story, but it is not the entire story. You learn quickly why. Turkeys are not always easy. If they are raised, they require feed and attention, and the flock might be considered more valuable alive for breeding than roasted for one day. If they are hunted, wild turkeys are sharp-eyed, fast, and not particularly interested in your holiday plans. Also, size matters in a very practical way. A large turkey is great if you have a big group, but if you have fewer mouths, a goose or a chicken or a smaller cut of meat might make more sense. Nothing is wasted. Everything is planned. Goose, if it appears, is dramatic in its own way. It brings fat. So much fat. People who have never cooked a goose think, "Oh, neat, poultry." People who have cooked a goose think, "Ah, yes, a manageable grease event." The skin can crisp beautifully. But the cook has to keep draining and saving the fat, because that fat becomes cooking gold for later meals. Goose fat can fry potatoes, enrich vegetables, and turn leftovers into something that feels like cheating. Joke number 1 slides in as you watch someone carefully spoon off fat with the reverence of a person handling a family heirloom. You realize the goose is basically a meat and a candle and an investment account all at once. Pork is another frequent holiday hero. A ham, a shoulder roast, or a salted piece that has been stored and then lovingly transformed back into special. Pork is dependable. It is familiar. It pairs well with apples, and apples are everywhere. A roast pork with apple sauce is one of those combinations that feels timeless, like humanity agreed on it early and never bothered to renegotiate. If the household keeps pigs, pork is a celebration that comes from their own yard, which makes it feel both practical and proud. Beef can appear, too, but it often signals a certain level of means. Cattle are valuable alive, not just as meat, but as labor and dairy. Serving beef might mean the family has done well, or that they have access to market. And venison, especially in rural and frontier settings, can be the holiday brag. It says, we know the land, we can provide. It is leaner, deeper in flavor, and often paired with rich sauces or gravies to soften its austerity. Fish is the curveball your modern Thanksgiving brain doesn't see coming. But it makes sense if you think like 1826. In coastal New England, salted cod is a staple, but fresh fish might be available depending on weather and access. Oysters, too, can show up, sometimes in stews or pies. The idea of oysters at Thanksgiving sounds fancy now, but back then, in some places, oysters are simply what the water gives in abundance. Historians still argue whether turkey's later dominance is more about cultural storytelling than actual early practice, and you can feel that debate at the table without anyone naming it. Because when turkey is present, it is treated as special. But when it is absent, the meal doesn't lose its meaning. The meaning is in gathering, in surviving the year, in honoring a harvest, in showing community. And then you catch a quirky tidbit that makes you blink. Some early American households serve a dish called mock turtle soup for special occasions. Made not from turtles, but from calves' heads or other parts. Seasoned and simmered into something meant to mimic fashionable English turtle soup. The fact that people are out here doing culinary cosplay in a farmhouse kitchen is both hilarious and impressive. Joke number 2. You realize the original "fake it till you make it" applies to soup. 2. The carving itself is a performance. The person with the knife, often the head of household or an honored guest, takes on the role with practiced seriousness. Slices are distributed according to rank, age, and a subtle family politics. The best pieces go to elders, honored visitors, or the minister. Children receive what is deemed appropriate, which is usually code for not the crispy skin you want. You watch a child's eyes follow the knife like it's tracking a magical artifact. The child is learning, early, that society is a system of portion control. If turkey is on the table, you notice it isn't automatically stuffed like modern birds. Sometimes it is, but stuffing can be cooked separately as a dressing to manage food safety and heat control. If it is stuffed, the filling is often simpler: bread, herbs, onions, maybe bits of meat or drippings. You might also see oysters appear in stuffing in some regions, which feels like the sea trying to get invited to a farm party. You taste it, and it is briny and rich, and you are forced to admit it works. As the plates circulate, conversation loosens. People start to compare the year, the weather, the crops, the price of goods, the reliability of neighbors, the health of relatives. Gratitude here is not abstract. It is specific. Thankful the corn came in, thankful the roof held, thankful the baby lived, thankful the father made it home. And yes, thankful the meat is plentiful enough that nobody has to pretend they are full when they are not. Joke number 3 lands softly as you take a second helping and realize the 1826 version of diet culture is simply winter, looming outside like a personal trainer with an axe. Nobody here is counting calories. They are counting weeks until spring. You look again at the centerpiece and understand something important. The turkey myth is a later simplification, a neat symbol that eventually becomes dominant because it is useful, memorable, and marketable. But the real Thanksgiving 200 years ago is more varied, more local, more honest. It is a table built from what the household can spare, what the season offers, and what the community brings. And as you chew, you feel the holiday's real heartbeat under the flavors. Not this specific bird, but we have enough. Enough to share, enough to host, enough to pause, even briefly, from the grinding rhythm of survival and say, out loud or quietly, that the year did not defeat us. You lean back for half a second, thinking you have earned a little breathing room, and then you notice the quiet heroes of the table. Not the roast, not the gravy, not the shiny centerpiece everyone keeps praising like it has a fan club. The real backbone is the stubborn, beige, dependable stuff. The crops that do not care about fashion, corn, squash, and the other hard-headed staples that get you through winter, whether or not anyone claps for them. A bowl of something yellowish sits near your elbow. It might be stewed squash, soft and sweet in a way that feels like the last warm day of October caught in a pot. It might be mashed pumpkin seasoned, simply because the cook knows better than to waste spices on something that already tastes like comfort. Nearby is cornbread or your cornmeal pudding, dense and satisfying, the kind of food that does not ask if you are emotionally ready. It just shows up and does its job. Here is the mainstream historical fact that holds all of this together. In early 19th century America, especially outside urban centers, corn is a foundational grain and appears in many forms at the table, while squash and other storage crops are vital because they keep well into winter. Wheat bread exists, yes, but wheat can be harder to grow in some regions, and flour might be expensive if it has to be purchased. Cornmeal, on the other hand, is everywhere. It becomes bread, mush, cakes, puddings. It is the quiet infrastructure of the meal. Corn shows up in ways that feel familiar and strange at the same time. You might get Johnny cakes, thin and fried, served hot, sometimes with butter, sometimes with a drizzle of molasses. You might get a loaf of cornbread baked in a pan near the coals, crusty at the edges, slightly smoky. You might get hasty pudding, which is not dessert but a thick cornmeal porridge, eaten with milk or butter or syrup. If someone says pudding here, your modern brain wants chocolate. Their brain wants corn. Historians still argue about how different regional foodways shape the meaning of traditional American meals. But you can taste the regional truth right now. The menu is geography on a plate. Squash is treated like a gift, because it kind of is. Winter squash stores well, sitting in cellars and pantries like edible lanterns. By late November, the household knows exactly how many remain and how long they need to last. Serving squash today is both celebration and calculation. It is a little flex that says, we have enough to share, while also saying, but not enough to be careless. You scoop some onto your plate and taste the sweetness that comes not from sugar, but from slow growing and patient storage. It has that earthy richness that feels like you are eating sunlight preserved in flesh. Someone nearby mentions that the squash crop was good this year, and the whole table nods in a way that makes you realize they are not being polite. They are genuinely relieved. There is also likely some form of beans. In New England, baked beans can be a staple. slow cooked with molasses or maple. Maybe a bit of pork if available. Beans are not glamorous, but they are protein that stores. They are the original we'll-be-fine food. If the table is heavy with meats, beans might still appear, not because anyone is desperate, but because the meal is about abundance, and abundance means showing the full range of what you have. Now, a quirky tidbit slips in from the margins of the table, something that makes you pause, mid-bite. Corn is not just food. It is a marker of identity and sometimes tension. Some families still use the word Indian in the names of corn-based dishes, reflecting the fact that many of these foodways originate from indigenous agricultural knowledge and cooking practices. But the way those origins are talked about is often casual, dismissive, or distorted. The dish arrives, everyone loves it, and the deeper story is barely acknowledged. It is like borrowing a song, singing it loudly, and never mentioning who wrote it. You can feel the weight of that even if no one says it out loud. Joke number 1. Soft and sleepy. You realize corn is basically the Wi-Fi of this century. If it's down, nothing works. Everyone pretends they're fine, but the whole house is quietly panicking. As the meal continues, you notice how these staples are eaten. People do not poke at them like side characters. They eat them seriously. Bread is used to mop gravy. Corn cakes are dunked. Squash is paired with salty meat to balance flavors. It is instinctive food pairing, born of habit rather than culinary school. You also notice the absence of certain modern staples. Potatoes are around in 1826, yes, and increasingly common, but they do not always dominate Thanksgiving the way they do later. Mashed potatoes are not yet the universal throne dish. In some households, turnips or parsnips might be just as prominent. In others, potatoes appear boiled or roasted. The idea that there is one correct side is simply not part of the worldview. The worldview is, eat what keeps you alive and makes the day feel special. The table conversation drifts into crops and weather, because that is what you talk about when your pantry depends on it. Someone mentions how early the frost came. Someone complains about pests. Someone else offers advice about planting times like they are, dropping the hottest gossip. Historians still argue whether the rise of a national Thanksgiving tradition later softened these local, agricultural conversations into a more generalized gratitude narrative. But you are hearing the original version. Gratitude, here, is not vague. It is agricultural accounting with emotion. You take another bite of cornbread and notice its texture, coarser than modern. Sometimes, depending on how finely the meal was ground, a little gritty, but not unpleasant, more like proof it is real. It fills your mouth with warmth. It makes you feel steady. It makes you understand why these staples are beloved. They are not exciting, but they are reliable in a world that is not. Joke number 2. You think about modern superfoods and realize the 1826 superfood is basically anything you can store without it betraying you. As plates are passed, you see how the cook has managed balance, rich meats, hearty breads, sweet squash, tangy pickles, dark molasses, beans. It is not a chef's tasting menu, but it is thoughtful. It is a meal built by someone who knows how bodies feel after a day of labor in cold weather. You need fat, carbohydrate, salt. You need something sweet to signal celebration. You need something sharp to keep you awake. And somewhere in the background, you sense the season pressing in. The day is short, night will come early. Outside, the cold waits patiently. Inside, these staples are like little shields, built from summer and stored for winter. Corn and squash are not just food, they are reassurance. Joke number 3 drifts by as you reach for more squash and think, with mild alarm, that you are becoming emotionally attached to a vegetable. You settle into the rhythm of chewing and listening, feeling the meal deepen. And as you look around, you realize something calming. The feast is not only about what's rare, it's about what endures. The dishes that show up year after year because they can, because they keep, because they make a hard season feel manageable. The table is full. Yes, but the real abundance is in resilience. Corn that feeds everyone, squash that lasts, beans that wait patiently in the pantry, bread that stretches the meal. You feel it in your stomach and in your chest, like a slow, steady warmth that is less about indulgence and more about survival made pleasant for one night. You think the meal has peaked, that you have reached the summit of fullness. And then someone says the word that makes every human being, in every century, suddenly find an extra pocket of space inside their body. Pie. The room shifts. Not loudly, not dramatically, but you feel the collective attention tilt toward the promise of sweetness. Dessert is not just dessert here. It is proof. Proof that the household has enough flour, enough fat, enough sweetener, enough time and enough control over the fire to make something that is not strictly necessary. And that is the first truth you learn as pies start appearing. Pie without perfection is still pie. And back in 1826, perfection is not even the goal. Survival is the goal. Celebration is the bonus round. Here is the mainstream historical fact that steadies your expectations. Early 19th century American desserts often rely on local fruit, molasses, maple sugar, and simple spices, and pies are common in many regions but vary widely in filling and style. Ovens are inconsistent, ingredients vary, and recipes are often guided by experience more than exact measurement. The result is delicious, yes, but not standardized. The modern idea of a perfect crust is mostly a later obsession. The first pie you see might be apple, because apples are everywhere and they store beautifully. The crust is thick, sometimes more protective than delicate, because flour quality varies and fat is precious. The edges might be crimped in a way that is more functional than decorative. If the cook has a bit of spice, you might taste cinnamon or nutmeg. If not, the sweetness and tartness carry the whole thing. Sometimes the apples are dried and rehydrated, which gives the filling a deeper, almost chewy richness. You take a bite and it tastes like the entire orchard decided to huddle together for warmth. Pumpkin pie might appear, but it doesn't always look like the smooth orange custard you picture. It can be more rustic. Sometimes it is made from squash rather than pumpkin, because pumpkin in old recipes can mean a range of winter squashes. The filling might be thicker, grainier, less sweet, sweetened with molasses or maple instead of refined sugar. If eggs and milk are plentiful, it becomes richer. If they're not, it becomes simpler. Either way, it tastes like earth and autumn and quiet confidence. Then there are pies that feel surprising to your modern palate. Mince pie, for example, might show up with its mix of chopped meat, dried fruit, spices, and sweetener. Yes, meat in a sweet pie. And before you make that face, remember, sugar is not abundant, and preserving meat with sweet and spice is a practical tradition with deep roots. The combination is dense, fragrant, and oddly addictive. You chew and your brain tries to classify it, fails, and then accepts that it's good anyway. And here comes your quirky tidbit, sliding onto the table with a straight face. Some families make vinegar pie, or other desperation-turned-tradition desserts, especially when fruit is scarce. Vinegar pie uses vinegar to mimic the tang of fruit in a sweet, custard-like filling, often with sugar or molasses, eggs if available, and butter if the household can spare it. It sounds like a prank. It is not. It is culinary improvisation with a poker face. Joke number 1. You realize people in 1826 are out here inventing desserts the way you invent excuses, and somehow they're doing it better. The crust, though, is the real drama, because crust is where the limitations of the era show themselves. No food processor, no chilled butter cubes measured in grams, no ice water precisely dribbled in while you whisper soothing words to gluten. It is hands, bowls, flour that might be a little inconsistent, and fat that could be butter, lard, or a mix depending on what's available. Lard makes a tender crust, and in many households it is common. Butter is prized for flavor. Sometimes the fat is not perfectly fresh. Sometimes it has a hint of barnyard. You do not comment. You swallow politely and tell yourself you are building character. The oven, if it's a brick oven, has its own personality. Heat rises and falls. Hot spots exist. A pie that looked fine at the edge might be underdone in the middle. The cook is watching by instinct. They listen for bubbling. They look for the right color. They tap the crust. They trust smell. A pie might come out too dark, and someone will scrape the burnt bits with a knife like it's no big deal. Because it isn't. Dessert is still dessert, even if it has a touch of charcoal charm. Historians still argue about how much early American cooking was shaped by British traditions versus uniquely American adaptations. And pies are a perfect example. You can taste the old world in mince and puddings. You can taste the new world in cornmeal-based sweets and the way maple sugar shows up like a regional signature. The table is a conversation between continents, carried out in crust and filling. As dessert is served, you notice the social ritual again. Pies are cut carefully. Portions are mindful. Children stare at the slices like they are watching treasure being divided. A guest is offered the best-looking piece, because hospitality is performance and kindness at once. You, being you, try to look casual while secretly tracking where the biggest slice is headed. Joke number 2. You discover your 21st century survival instinct is not hunting, it's dessert awareness. Alongside pie, there might be something like custard, or a simple cake, or cookies if someone has had the time and resources. But often, the desserts are fruit-based because fruit is what the household has stored. Dried berries reappear as sauces. Preserved peaches if someone has them, though that can be rare. A bowl of nuts, maybe. Walnuts, chestnuts in some regions. A plate of cheese might show up too, especially if the household has dairy and wants to keep the table feeling abundant. Cheese with pie is not weird here. It is practical, filling, and honestly, kind of brilliant. The sweetness itself feels different. If molasses is the main sweetener, desserts have a dark, almost smoky undertone. If maple sugar is used, there's a soft woodsy note. If refined sugar appears, it feels almost bright, almost modern. But even then, desserts are not as sweet as what you might be used to. Sugar is expensive. Sweetness is a treat, not a default. You savor it slowly because you can feel that the household is savoring it too, even if they pretend not to. And as you sit there, the room a little quieter now. People leaning back in chairs, the fire's warmth starting to seep into tired bones. You realize dessert is doing more than satisfying cravings. It is marking the day as different, special, worth the extra work, worth the extra risk of burning something, worth the extra flour. Joke number 3 floats in as you take one more bite of pie and think, with sudden humility, that you would absolutely trade your phone charger for one more slice if you were truly living here. The plates slowly empty. Conversation softens. Someone loosens a collar. Someone laughs a little louder now that the hardest part is done. The kitchen, that earlier battleground, has delivered its reward, and you, full and warm, can finally feel what this part of Thanksgiving is meant to be. Not perfect, not pretty, but real. A sweet ending to a day built from effort, with crust that might be uneven, fillings that might be improvised, and gratitude that tastes like molasses and smoke. You lean back, stomach heavy, mind floating, and your modern instincts go hunting for the next scheduled activity. In your world, this is the moment where someone clicks on football, a parade blares in the background, and half the room slowly turns into naps, shaped like humans. But here, in 1826, there's no televised anything, no marching balloons, no couch that swallows you like a friendly beast. Entertainment exists. Sure, but it's the kind that can happen with nothing but people, a little light, and maybe one instrument that's slightly out of tune. And you find out quickly that fun in this era has a suspicious habit of looking like work, or at least looking like practice for work. Here's the mainstream historical fact that frames the whole evening: early 19th century Thanksgiving observances, where they exist, often include religious services or prayer, and then social visiting, conversation, music, and simple games, rather than large public spectacles. Community is the entertainment. Storytelling is the streaming service. If you want a show, you make it with your mouth and your memory. After dessert, chairs scrape back, and the room rearranges itself. Not dramatically, but with that slow, practical movement of people who are used to making a small space do multiple jobs. The table might be cleared, dishes carried away, the best cloth folded carefully like it's being put back into hibernation. Someone stokes the fire. Someone brings out candles, because daylight has already given up. The flame of each candle feels precious, little trembling pockets of time, and you suddenly understand why people went to bed earlier back then. Darkness is not an aesthetic. Darkness is a schedule. Visitors linger. And because travel is hard, they're not just dropping in for an hour. They've come with commitment. Coats hang by the door, boots dry near the hearth. There's that faint smell of wet wool and smoke, like the whole house has turned into a cozy storage box for humans. People start talking in clusters. The younger ones hover near the edges, hoping to be included, but also hoping not to be assigned chores. Someone produces a fiddle, maybe, or a simple flute. In some homes, it might be a small pump organ, but instruments vary, and not every household has one. If there's a fiddle, it's not polished concert hall vibes. It's lived in. It's been played at weddings, barn raisings, and nights when the snow made the world too quiet. The first notes cut through the soft murmur of conversation, and the room brightens, not because the song is perfect, but because it is familiar. You watch feet start to tap. Someone hums along without thinking. And then, if the household is the kind that allows it, someone stands and starts a dance, not a choreographed performance, but a simple set dance, maybe a reel, maybe something handed down from Scottish or Irish traditions, maybe a local variation that nobody can quite name. The floorboards thump, the laughter gets louder, people spin, skirts swish, boots scuff. It's joyful, but it's also practical. Dancing keeps you warm. Dancing keeps you awake. Dancing is exercise in disguise, which is basically the greatest trick ever invented. Joke number 1. You realize the original Fitspiration is just your aunt grabbing your hand and dragging you into a dance while you're still digesting pie like a brick. If dancing isn't happening, games are. But again, these are not board games with glossy boxes. They're simple, often verbal, often involving memory, rhythm, or dexterity. Riddles, word games, I spy type observations. Sometimes someone pulls out a deck of cards, though card playing can be viewed with suspicion in certain religious households, lumped in with gambling and general moral collapse. If cards are frowned upon, the entertainment gets more wholesome and more creative. Children play their own games, sometimes with carved wooden toys, sometimes with nothing but imagination and a dangerously energetic willingness to sprint indoors. They might play tag around the table legs until someone gives them the look. The look is timeless. The look crosses centuries. The look says, "Do that again and you'll be scrubbing something tomorrow." Storytelling becomes a centerpiece. And here is where the night turns into something you can almost feel in your bones. People tell stories of the year. The storm that nearly took the roof. The cow that got loose and led 3 grown men on a humiliating chase. The neighbor who tried to fix a wagon wheel and somehow invented a new kind of disaster. The stories are funny because they have to be. Humor is not optional in a hard life. It's an internal insulation layer. The stories also slide into news, and you hear snippets of the wider world. Politics, prices, rumors. Someone mentions a recent election or a change in local government. Someone else complains about taxes or tariffs like it's their favorite hobby. Historians still argue about how politically charged Thanksgiving gatherings were in different regions. But you can hear it now. A table full of full stomachs is a table full of opinions. And then there are the songs. Hymns, especially if the household is religious. People might sing in a way that is not trained but is wholehearted. Voices blending, imperfect and sincere. The sound fills the room like warmth. Even if you don't know the words, you feel the effect. Community becomes audible. Now, here's your quirky tidbit for the evening. In some communities, especially where harvest celebrations are tied to older European customs, there are little mumming or masquerade-like traditions around late fall and winter where people might perform skits, wear simple disguises, or play pranks. Not everywhere, not always, and certainly not in the strictest homes. But the idea that people 200 years ago sometimes entertained themselves by dressing up and doing low-budget theater in someone's parlor is both adorable and deeply chaotic. Joke number 2. You suddenly understand that if you gave these people a cardboard box and a curtain, they'd invent TikTok in a week. As the evening stretches, you notice how entertainment is also instruction. A father teaches a boy a knot. Someone shows a child how to carve a small piece of wood. A girl learns a new stitch from an older woman while listening to gossip that is definitely not meant for her ears. You realize the games aren't always games. They're skills disguised as play, because that's how you teach without making children revolt. The fire settles lower, candles shorten, people grow softer around the edges, voices dropping. Someone yawns without trying to hide it. In a modern home, you might transition to screens. Here, you transition to quiet. The house has a natural rhythm. It rises with work. It peaks with the meal. It drifts down with stories and song. It prepares for sleep like an animal curling in for winter. Historians still argue whether early Thanksgiving traditions are best understood as religious observances that later became secular, or as social feasts that were always quietly secular beneath a religious surface. Sitting here, you can see both layers. Prayer might have started the meal, hymns might still hang in the air, but the laughter, the dancing, the stories about runaway cows, they're deeply human, not doctrinal. And you feel it, this strange comfort, without big spectacles, without programmed entertainment. The night belongs to the people in the room. It's messy, it's warm, it's sometimes awkward, it's alive. You watch someone poke the fire, sparks lifting briefly, and you realize that this is the real parade. A circle of light held against the dark, made brighter by voices. You shift in your chair, full and drowsy, and the room continues around you. Unhurried. No halftime show. No commercials. Just the slow, satisfying sound of a household being together, letting the day land gently and preparing, eventually, to face winter again tomorrow. The laughter fades into softer conversation, and you feel the night tilt towards something steadier, like the house itself is guiding everyone back onto a track of expectation. Because as relaxed as the evening can get, Thanksgiving in this era often has a moral spine. Not just be thankful as a vibe, but be thankful as a requirement. Like a rule posted somewhere invisible but enforced with looks. In many households, the day is threaded through with church, scripture, and community pressure that's polite on the surface and firm underneath. You can almost feel it in the way people sit up straighter when certain topics come up, or how someone lowers their voice when they mention a neighbor's misfortune, as if speaking too casually about hardship might tempt fate. Here is the mainstream historical fact that grounds this part of the day. In early 19th century, New England especially, Thanksgiving is often proclaimed by state or local authorities as a day of public thanksgiving and prayer, and church attendance or family worship commonly shapes the observance. It is not only a feast, it is an acknowledgement that the harvest and survival of the year are seen, by many, as gifts from Providence. In some places, that religious framing is the whole point, with the meal almost functioning as the reward for proper gratitude, if the family attended a service earlier. You can still sense the residue of it, the way certain phrases are repeated, the way elders reference the sermon as if it's a shared text message everyone received. If they didn't attend, there might still be reading at home. A Bible opened with the seriousness of opening a legal contract. Someone's voice might have carried through a passage about blessings, duty, humility, and even now, hours later, you feel how it lingers. You watch the social choreography around gratitude. Someone compliments the meal, and it's not just, "This is good." It's, "We are blessed." Someone mentions the year's weather, and it's not just lucky. It's, "We were spared." These are small linguistic habits, but they shape the whole atmosphere. Gratitude is not only personal emotion, it is public performance. You're expected to show it, to name it, to live it, and preferably not to sound like you're bragging while doing so. Historians still argue whether this religious intensity weakened as Thanksgiving spread beyond New England and became more nationally defined later. But in this room, you feel the older style. It's not harsh exactly, but it is watchful, like the holiday is keeping score. And you can see how community pressure operates without shouting. A neighbor might be discussed with concern, "They've had a hard season." That concern often comes with an unspoken verdict. Did they work hard enough? Did they make foolish choices? Did they fall into laziness? Or are they truly unlucky? People in a tight rural community know each other's habits the way you know your phone's battery percentage. Nothing is invisible. If someone is struggling, everyone knows. And Thanksgiving becomes a moment when the community quietly confirms who is doing well and who is not, based on the size of the feast, the cleanliness of the home, the behavior of the children, the condition of clothing. You notice the way guests look around, not rudely, but with that quick scan that says, "Ah, they've managed," or, "Oh, they're stretched thin." And you realize hosting is not only hospitality, it is a reputation test. You are showing your household's competence, your thrift, your order, your morality. By implication, it's exhausting if you think about it too hard. Joke number 1. You suddenly understand that the original influencer culture is just your neighbors silently ranking your gravy and your child's manners. At the same time, There is real warmth in the religious part of it for many people. In a world where illness can take someone quickly, where crops can fail, where winter can be brutal, the act of pausing to name what went right is not empty. It's stabilizing. It helps people feel less at the mercy of randomness. It gives meaning to hardship. You see someone's face soften when they talk about a baby who survived a fever, or a father who returned safely from travel. Gratitude is not a slogan. It's a quiet relief made audible. The moral expectations extend to behavior at the table and in the room. Drinking exists, yes, but in many religious communities it's expected to stay moderate, especially on a day framed as sacred. Laughter is allowed, but not crude. Stories can be funny, but there's a line. If someone starts drifting toward gossip that feels too sharp, an elder might redirect with a gentle cough or a change of subject. It's subtle control, like steering a boat with small corrections. You also feel how Thanksgiving can act as a social glue. People settle old tensions, or at least they pretend to. An argument that's been simmering might be paused for the sake of the day, because open conflict on Thanksgiving would be seen as ungrateful. And nobody wants to be that person. Forgiveness, or at least temporary peace, becomes part of the ritual. You watch two relatives exchange polite words that are clearly doing a lot of work, and you respect the effort, even if it's slightly awkward. Now, a quirky tidbit slips out from the religious side of things. Some Thanksgiving proclamations in this era include language that isn't only about thanking for abundance, but also about fasting, repentance, and acknowledging sins. Yes, you heard that correctly. In certain places, a Thanksgiving day can carry a tone of solemn reflection, even warning. The feast and the sermon can coexist in the same breath. It's like being told, enjoy your pie, but also consider your moral failures. That's a very specific kind of holiday energy. Joke number 2. You imagine a modern Thanksgiving where the host hands you a second helping and says, also, reflect deeply on your shortcomings. And you almost choke on your imaginary cranberry sauce. As the night goes on, the conversation sometimes shifts toward charity. In a small community, people know who needs help. Thanksgiving can be a time when food is shared, quietly delivered to someone who is struggling, or contributions are gathered through church networks. It's not always organized, and it isn't always fair, but the impulse exists. People understand that winter is coming, and a family without enough will become everyone's problem sooner or later. Aid is partly compassion, partly community self-preservation. Historians still argue about how inclusive these early Thanksgiving practices were, and the answer depends heavily on where you are and who you are. In some places, community support is real. In others, social judgment is harsher than help. And the holiday can amplify that harshness by making disparities visible. A big feast on one table throws another table's emptiness into sharper relief. You sit with that tension. Gratitude is encouraged, but gratitude can be complicated. How grateful do you feel if you are the one doing all the labor and receiving little credit? How grateful do you feel if you are poor and being watched? How grateful do you feel if you're not fully welcomed? The holiday's moral framing can comfort some and burden others. Still, in this room, in this moment, you feel the intention most people are reaching for, to mark survival as meaningful, to name blessings out loud so they feel real, to remind each other that they are connected, that they belong to something bigger than the day's menu. The candles are lower now, flames smaller, shadows softer. Someone's voice drops into a gentle tone, talking about the coming winter and the hope that everyone will stay healthy. The room listens. You feel a collective quiet settle in. Not awkward, but calm. You realize that in 1826, Thanksgiving is not just a feast you attend. It is a social mirror. It reflects your household's work, your community's bonds, your religious beliefs, and your place in the local web of judgment and care. And as you breathe in the smoky air and the last sweetness of a pie on your tongue, you sense that tomorrow the work will return. But tonight, the community pauses together under candlelight, trying to hold gratitude steady in a world that rarely holds still. By the time the candles are halfway down, you start realizing something that modern holidays have mostly forgotten. When people come for Thanksgiving in 1826, they do not just come for the meal. They come as an event. They come as logistics. They come as sleeping arrangements, extra mouths at breakfast, and the gentle chaos of bodies sharing space in a house that was not built for hosting season, because travel is slow, cold, and inconvenient. Guests often actually stay over. Not always. Not everywhere, but often enough that the household treats it as normal. If your cousin lives 10 miles away, that distance can mean hours by wagon, and in November, darkness and weather make the return trip risky. So people arrive early, and they linger late, and the holiday stretches beyond the table like a long scarf. Here is the mainstream historical fact that explains why this feels so different. In the early 19th century, travel is typically by foot, horse, or wagon. Roads can be poor. Daylight is short, and overnight stays are a practical necessity for visiting relatives and attending religious services or gatherings. Going home after dinner is not a casual choice if the route includes muddy ruts, freezing wind, and the possibility of getting lost or breaking an axle. So the house becomes a temporary inn, and hosting becomes a multi-day undertaking. You watch the shift happen almost invisibly. Someone glances toward the window, notices the dark thickening outside, and makes a small decision that changes the rest of the night. A guest says, "It's getting on," and the host responds with something like, "You'll stay." Of course. And it is phrased like a kindness, but it's also a rule. You do not send family into the night unless you have to, and you do not refuse an offer to stay unless you want to cause a small social earthquake. Now the house starts transforming again, from dining hall to sleeping puzzle. Quilts are brought out. Extra blankets emerge from chests. Feather beds, if the household has them, are like luxury items, saved for elders or honored guests. Children might be bundled into corners, shared beds, or pallets on the floor near the hearth. The floor becomes a sleeping surface with a few layers of straw or quilts. It's not glamorous, but it's warm enough if you're positioned correctly. Joke number 1 arrives as you realize guest room in 1826 means any place your body fits, and your modern back starts writing a complaint letter in advance. The hosts are doing math, not the kind of math you do on a spreadsheet, but the kind you do in your head while you pretend you're just being friendly. How many blankets? How many pillows? Who snores? Who gets cold easily? Who will complain politely and then complain loudly later? Who needs to be placed far from the drafty wall? Who should not be placed near the toddler who wakes up screaming like it's their hobby? The guests, for their part, participate in the ritual. They might offer help. They might say, "Don't trouble yourself." While still fully accepting the trouble, they might bring small gifts or contributions to ease the burden. A loaf, a jar of preserves, a bit of cheese. Sometimes a guest brings news, which is its own kind of payment. Stories, gossip, updates on distant relatives. Information is valuable in a world without instant communication, and the social dance continues. Someone insists the elder take the best bed. Someone else insists they don't need it. The elder takes it anyway because everyone knows the script. A young person gets sent upstairs or into the loft, which can be colder but also fun, because it's where cousins whisper and giggle in the dark. You end up among them, and you feel the energy shift from formal gratitude to late-night human chaos. The house at night sounds different when it's full. Floorboards creak under extra footsteps. The fire pops. Outside, wind scrapes the walls. Inside, voices soften, but they don't disappear. Someone coughs. Someone laughs quietly. Someone tells one last story. Because endings are hard. The day is too big to let go of cleanly. Here is your quirky tidbit, tucked into the bedding like a secret in many homes, especially in colder seasons. People might warm the bed with heated objects, like stones warmed by the fire and wrapped in cloth, or a metal bed warmer if the household has one. The idea is simple. Shove warmth into the cold sheets before you climb in. It's a practical trick, and it also makes you realize how brave modern people are not. Because you are watching someone casually place a heated stone into bedding and trusting it not to become an accidental campfire. Joke number 2. You think about modern, cozy bedtime routines and realize yours is basically place a suspiciously hot rock near your legs and hope for the best. Now, the overnight stay isn't just physical, it's social. When people stay in your home, they see you. Not the polished version you present at dinner, but the real version. They see the mess you didn't have time to hide. They hear how you speak to your children. They notice whether you pray before bed. They notice whether you keep the fire going well. Hosting overnight is like inviting someone into your operating system. This is where little tensions can rise. A guest might have different habits, different expectations. Someone might want more prayer. Someone might want less. Someone might snore loud enough to make the roof vibrate. Someone might wake early and start moving around. And the hosts, who are exhausted, might feel their patience thinning. Thanksgiving is still a holiday, but it's also an endurance test. Historians still argue how much early Thanksgiving gatherings served as tools for maintaining kinship networks across distance versus simply celebrating harvest and religious gratitude. But when you're lying on a pallet listening to cousins whisper, you can feel the kinship network in action. These visits matter because they keep families connected in a world where you might not see each other often. A bad winter, an illness, a move west, and a relative could vanish from your life for years. So when you gather hard. The next morning is already being planned. Even as people settle to sleep. Leftovers will be served, but not lazily. Breakfast might include bread, warmed pies, maybe meat sliced thin, maybe porridge. Coffee might appear if the household has it, or tea, or something simpler. The day after Thanksgiving is not a day off. It's a continuation. Animals still need feeding. Fires still need tending. Water still needs hauling. As you drift towards sleep, you feel the house's warmth at the center and the cold pressing in at the edges. You hear the occasional crack of wood in the hearth, the sigh of someone turning over, the faint murmur of late-night conversation dying out. It's oddly comforting, like being inside a shared nest. Joke number 3 arrives right as you finally get comfortable. You realize the 1826 version of privacy is simply turning your head slightly away from the person sleeping 2 feet from you. And yet, even with the cramped space, the noise, the logistics, the lack of personal bubble, there's a sweetness in it. The holiday is not contained in a single meal. It is stretched across time, across rooms, across blankets and whispers in the slow settling of a full house. You are not just celebrating. You are belonging. The candles go out one by one. The dark inside becomes softer, layered with the sound of breathing and the faint glow of embers. Outside, winter holds the house in its quiet grip. Inside, everyone has gathered close. And for tonight, at least, the world feels smaller, warmer, and held together by food, family, and the simple fact that nobody has to travel the cold road home. Morning comes early because morning always comes early here, whether you want it or not. The house is still half dark, the embers in the hearth glowing like sleepy eyes, and the air has that night-chilled bite again. You blink yourself awake on your pallet or shared bed and immediately remember there is no such thing as sleeping in when animals exist and water has to be carried. The holiday does not pause the farm, it just dresses it up. And the kids are already moving. Not because they're noble little angels of industry, but because children in 1826 are woven into the household's functioning the way threads are woven into cloth. They are loved, yes, but they are also labor. And on Thanksgiving, even with guests around, chores still happen. The difference is that there are more hands to do them and more eyes to notice whether the kids are useful. Here is the mainstream historical fact that frames your whole. Mourning in early 19th century rural households. Children commonly contribute to domestic and farm labor from a young age, doing age-appropriate tasks like fetching water, gathering eggs, feeding animals, carrying wood, and assisting with food preparation. Childhood exists. But it's not separated from work the way modern childhood often is. Skills are taught through doing, and doing is expected. You sit up and hear a small voice already negotiating with an adult. "Can I have pie for breakfast?" The adult answers in the tone of someone who has heard this question since the dawn of time, after you feed the chickens. And there it is. The deal. Pleasure is allowed, but it is stapled to responsibility. Pie is not a right. Pie is a reward. Joke number 1. You realize the original earning screen time is earning warmed-up mince pie. And honestly, the old system has merit. You pull on clothes that are slightly stiffer from yesterday's drying and the faint smell of smoke that never really leaves. Downstairs, someone is already stirring the coals into life. The kitchen is waking up like a second sun. A pot is set on. Water is heated for washing and for whatever breakfast becomes. The smell of coffee might appear if the household has it, but coffee is not universal. Some families drink tea. Some drink a roasted grain beverage. Some simply drink warm milk or water. Whatever it is, the point is warmth and waking. Children slip in and out of the door, sent on missions. One carries a small bucket toward the well, shoulders hunched against cold. Another heads to the henhouse, trying to look brave while still secretly worried a rooster might choose violence today. A younger one is told to gather kindling and comes back with twigs in triumph, as if they've returned from a heroic expedition. In the yard, the tasks are steady. Animals need feeding, no matter how festive yesterday was. Chickens cluck impatiently. Pigs grunt. A cow lowing sounds like a complaint letter being read aloud. Kids do the chores because their smaller bodies fit into spaces, because they're quick, because they're learning, and because adults have other tasks that require strength and focus. It's a system that makes sense, even if it feels strict by modern standards. But the holiday does add a layer of softness. Adults might be a little more patient, a little more generous with treats. A child who has behaved might get an extra bit of butter on bread. A toddler might be indulged with a piece of sweetened squash. There is still hierarchy, but the day after Thanksgiving carries a gentle glow from the feast, like the warmth of the fire lingering in the bricks. Inside, children help with leftovers. They carry plates. They scrape and save. They learn that nothing goes to waste. The roast bones are not trash. They're future broth. The bread ends are not useless. They're future crumbs or pudding. The fat saved from yesterday's meat is set aside carefully, because it will flavor tomorrow's meals. Watching a child be trusted with a crock of saved fat is like watching someone be handed the family jewels. Here's your quirky tidbit for this morning. Kids often have a surprisingly direct relationship with grown-up realities, including butchering and food preservation. In many rural households, a child might know how to pluck a bird, turn a spit, or help salt meat long before they can read well. It sounds harsh, but it also means they understand the world in a concrete way. Food is not abstract. It has weight, smell, process. You can see that knowledge in the way a child handles a knife with careful respect. Not because they're fearless, but because they've been taught the stakes. Historians still argue whether this early integration of children into labor produced more capable adulthood or simply reflected economic necessity at the cost of a protected childhood. Sitting here, you can see both truths at once. There's pride in competence. There's also an absence of leisure that modern people would call essential. The kids laugh, yes. They play, yes. But their play is squeezed between tasks. After breakfast, kids might get a little window of freer time, especially if guests are still in the house. They might run outside, cheeks pink, chasing each other in the cold, making up games with sticks and snow and pure energy. They might tease each other. They might retell last night's stories with exaggerated drama. Cousins form little alliances and rivalries that feel like ancient kingdoms. Joke number 2. You watch a group of children create an entire government system out of nothing but a snowbank and a grudge. And you think, so nothing changes. You also notice how the presence of guests changes discipline. A child who might normally be scolded sharply is corrected more gently because nobody wants to look like an angry household. Or in some families. Discipline is even stricter because the household is being watched. Behave, or you embarrass us. The child's face tightens with the pressure of reputation. Thanksgiving is a family holiday, but it's also a public display, and kids are part of the display whether they ask to be or not, if the family is religious. There might be morning prayer again, brief, a way of closing the holiday circle. Or there might be a quiet reading. Children fidget. Adults pretend not to notice. Everyone has a role. Throughout the morning, the kids are in motion, and you start to understand why. Winter is coming hard. A holiday is not a pause. It is a bright spot. The work still has to happen, and children, being part of the household economy, are part of that work. Historians still argue about the degree to which early American family life was shaped by affection versus authority. But you can see affection in small gestures. A mother smoothing a child's hair, a father ruffling a boy's cap, an older sibling slipping a treat to a younger one. And you can see authority in the way chores are assigned, in the way children respond quickly when called. Love and structure are braided together here. It's not always gentle, but it is deeply connected. As the morning stretches, the guests begin preparing to leave if the weather allows. Children help gather belongings. They fetch coats. They stand at the door watching wagons get loaded. They wave with the kind of excited sadness kids have when something special ends. They're tired, too. But they'll never admit it. Their bodies are buzzing with leftover sugar and leftover celebration. Joke number 3 lands softly as you watch a child try to negotiate keeping a cousin's toy. And you realize the 1826 version of "Can We Stay Longer" is "Can We Keep the Wooden Whistle?" By late morning. The house begins to thin. The quiet returns in layers. The adults look a little more tired now that the performance is ending. The children, still half hyper, still half drowsy, are gently folded back into the everyday rhythm. And you, standing there with cold fingers and a full stomach, realize that 200 years ago, Thanksgiving is not a single day that stands apart from life. It is stitched into life. The chores, the labor, the teaching, the play, the discipline, the treats. It all runs together. And even as the holiday glow fades, you can still feel it in the way the children move. They carry the memory of a full table and a crowded house. And they carry, too, the quiet lesson the adults have been teaching without words. Community and work are how you make it through the cold. You thought yesterday's discomfort was the main event. But now it's time for the real villain to step into the spotlight. Clothing. Because Thanksgiving isn't just a meal in 1826. It's also the day you put on your best and then immediately discover that your best is still trying to defeat you. You start with layers, always layers. Linen under things, wool over them, and possibly a vest or shawl depending on who you are and where you are. Everything feels heavier than you expect. Nothing feels like it was designed for lounging. There is no stretchy waistband coming to save you. Your buttons are the boss now. If you're wearing stockings, they're snug. If you're wearing boots, they're stiff. If you're wearing shoes, they're probably not waterproof, which is bold considering the weather's personality. Here is the mainstream historical fact that sets the scene. Early 19th century clothing is largely made from natural fibers, like wool, linen, and cotton, often produced or repaired at home. And Sunday best clothing is worn for church and special occasions, with garments expected to last for years. People have fewer outfits than you do. Clothes are investments. Wearing your best is both celebration and public statement. So you dress carefully, because today you're not just warm, you are visible. Thanksgiving is when relatives and neighbors see you, and that means your clothes are part of your story. A clean collar says order. A mended seam says thrift. A well-kept bonnet or hat says respectable. Even if everyone is polite, they are noticing. The holiday is a social inspection disguised as a family gathering. You look down at your feet and immediately understand why the phrase cold toes becomes a life philosophy. Floors are cold, yards are muddy, roads are wet, and your shoes, even if they're decent leather, do not have modern rubber soles or insulation. If you step wrong in slush, your feet will remember it for hours. You either wear boots and deal with stiffness, or you wear shoes and accept dampness. There is no perfect choice. This is the era's whole vibe. Joke number 1. You realize the 1826 fashion industry is basically a conspiracy to keep you slightly uncomfortable at all times, just to prove you're serious. You catch sight of someone's hands, red and cracked from cold and soap and work. Even the best-dressed person in the room has signs of labor. Gloves exist, yes, but they're not always worn indoors, and they're not always thick enough. Hands are a reveal. They show the year. They show the work. They show the household's reality no matter how nice the dress or coat looks. If you are in a household with means, you see finer fabrics, maybe a coat with better tailoring, a dress with more careful stitching, a bit of ribbon, maybe even a touch of imported cloth. But even here, nothing is casual. Wearing fine clothing is not just style. It is statement. It is saying, we have access. It's also saying, we can protect this garment from daily ruin, which is honestly an achievement. If you are in a household with less, best might still mean patched. It might mean a dress that has been altered and re-altered, a coat that belonged to someone else first, a shirt that has been mended so many times it's basically a quilt with ambition. And still, it is worn with pride. The cloth is clean, the buttons are fastened, the effort is visible. Here's a quirky tidbit that sneaks in like a loose thread. People often use clothing as storage, not in a pockets full of receipts way, but in a this is where I keep my life way. A small pouch hidden in layers. a handkerchief tucked into a bodice, a pocket sewn inside a skirt. For some women's clothing, pockets can be separate tie-on pouches under layers, accessed through slits in the outer garment. So while you feel like you have no freedom of movement, you do, in fact, have a secret inventory system. Joke number 2. You realize you're basically wearing a medieval-style purse network under your outfit, and you start to respect the engineering. Then comes the mud. Because no matter how dignified you look inside, the moment you step outside, the yard has opinions. November ground is rarely neat. It's churned by hooves, wagons, boots. It's wet. It's sticky. It clings. You take one step and feel the earth try to keep your shoe as a souvenir. You take another, and your hem brushes something you do not want to identify. The weather does not care about your Sunday best. The weather is the ultimate critic. You see people manage this with practiced resignation. Skirts lifted slightly, boots wiped at the door, extra cloth laid down in bad spots. Nobody panics. Everyone expects it. Part of looking respectable is not staying pristine. It's staying composed while getting slightly wrecked. Inside, the room temperature changes how you feel in your clothes. Near the fire, you're sweating. Away from the fire, you're chilled, so you adjust constantly. Shawl on, shawl off, coat draped, coat worn. It's like your body is running its own little climate negotiation. You watch someone tuck their hands into their sleeves to warm them and realize that gesture has been done in exactly this way for centuries. Historians still argue about how rigid social class markers were in early American rural communities compared to cities, but clothing is one of the clearest markers. Even if everyone eats the same roast, you can see differences in fabric quality, cleanliness, and fit. Yet you also see something leveling: the cold. The cold does not care if your coat is imported wool. It will find your wrists anyway. As the day progresses, the best clothing becomes a slight burden. You have to protect it. You can't lean against everything. You can't help with heavy chores without risking stains. So, dressing up is also a shift in role. The people in best clothing are more likely to be the ones sitting, visiting, hosting in the front room. The people in more practical clothing are more likely to be moving in and out of the kitchen, lifting pots, washing, carrying water. The outfit becomes a job assignment. Joke number 3. You suddenly understand that business casual exists in 1826 too, except the business is keeping everyone alive. And the casual is, please don't ruin the only nice shirt. When the guests arrive, the clothing becomes a kind of language. Compliments are exchanged carefully. That's a fine shawl. Your bonnet sits so well. These are not shallow comments. They are acknowledgments of effort, skill, and sometimes sacrifice. A well-made garment might represent hours of spinning, weaving, sewing, or money spent that could have gone elsewhere. Praising it is praising survival with style, and when the day winds down, you feel the relief that comes when the best clothes can finally be removed and saved again. The garment is folded, placed carefully away, like it is going back into a vault. It will not be worn for ordinary days. It will wait for the next moment when the household needs to present itself to the world. You stand there with your toes a little cold, your shoulders a little tired from fabric weight, and you realize clothing 200 years ago isn't just about looking good. It's about announcing stability. We are clean. We are prepared. We have enough to mark this day as special. The mud on the hem is proof you walked through a real world. The soot you can't fully wash away is proof you live close to the fire that keeps you alive. And as you look around the room, the candlelight catching on wool and linen, you feel the subtle comfort of it. Everyone is wrapped in their best effort. And for one day, the community sees it. The meal is behind you now. But the real feast of human behavior is still happening. Because after the plates are cleared and the tablecloth is folded away, like a sleeping animal, you enter the zone where manners and tiny rebellions take over. This is the part of Thanksgiving that doesn't show up in paintings. The part where everyone is trying to be respectable while also being, themselves. You sit at a table that has its own invisible rules. Who speaks first? Who gets served first? Who gets the nicer chair? Who is allowed to joke? Who has to laugh politely? The hierarchy is subtle, but it's there, woven into the room like the threads in the cloth you are just trying not to stain. Here is the mainstream historical fact that shapes the whole atmosphere in early 19th century Anglo-American households, especially those influenced by Protestant and genteel ideals. Table manners and social etiquette are important markers of respectability, and special occasions like Thanksgiving emphasize order, deference, and proper behavior. People may not own much, but they can still perform refinement, and performing it matters. You watch how serving happens. Dishes are passed, not grabbed. Elders are offered the best cuts. Guests are honored with first choice. Children are reminded, sometimes with a look, sometimes with a light tap on the wrist, not to reach across the table like they're storming a fort. You can almost hear the etiquette lessons being transmitted through silence. And yet, even in a room full of manners, rebellion finds a way. It always does. A child tries to sneak a piece of crisp skin from the roast before it's properly distributed. A cousin pretends to accidentally get a bigger slice of pie. Someone takes an extra spoonful of something sweet when they think no one is watching. You see the tiny crimes of appetite happening in real time. And honestly, it's charming because it's so human. Joke number 1. You realize Thanksgiving has always been about two things: gratitude and low-level food theft. You also notice how adults rebel, but in quieter ways. An uncle makes a joke that rides right up to the line of what's acceptable and then stops just short, like he's daring the room to react. A woman rolls her eyes in a way that is perfectly timed to be seen only by the person she wants to see it. Someone takes a slightly larger pour of cider than propriety suggests. Not enough to be scandalous, just enough to feel like they won something. Seating arrangements are a whole silent negotiation. In some homes, the head of the table is clear, and the hierarchy is rigid. In others, it's more flexible, but still guided by age and status. Guests might be placed strategically to prevent arguments. That cousin who always starts political debates is not seated next to the minister. The two relatives with old grievances are kept apart by placing a talkative aunt between them like a human firewall. You can feel it even if you're not told. The seating is a map of the family's internal weather. Now here's your quirky tidbit, sliding in under the table like a mischievous cat. In some households, especially those influenced by older traditions or just plain rural practicality, the best table manners can coexist with some pretty earthy habits. People might eat with knives and spoons, but not always with forks in the modern sense, depending on the household's utensils. Forks exist, yes, but they're not universally used the way they become later. Some families have them, some don't, and some treat them like fancy accessories rather than required equipment. So you might witness someone calmly, politely, and respectfully eating in a way that would make a modern etiquette coach faint. Joke number 2. You imagine a Victorian manners expert time-traveling in, seeing someone use a knife with calm confidence, and immediately evaporating into judgment. Conversation at the table is its own etiquette dance. Topics are chosen carefully. The weather is safe. Crops are safe. General gratitude is safe. Complimenting the food is always safe, as long as you don't overdo it and make it sound like you've never eaten before. Politics might be allowed depending on the household, but it can also be the spark that lights a slow-burning argument. Religion is often present, but not always debated openly. Gossip exists, but it's supposed to be concern rather than cruelty. Children are trained in this moment. They're taught not to interrupt, to say please, to wait their turn. They're also taught how to read the room, how to sense when an adult is about to scold them, how to look innocent while holding evidence of mischief in their hand. This is social education, happening live. After the meal, the room shifts toward visiting, and the rules loosen slightly. People move to chairs and corners, and the conversation grows more personal. This is where the tiny rebellions become even more interesting. Someone slips away to the kitchen to grab another bite of pie, pretending they're helping. Someone steps outside for a breath of cold air just to escape the noise. Someone sits with a person they're not supposed to be flirting with and pretends it's purely innocent conversation about the weather. Historians still argue whether courtship rituals in rural communities were more strictly supervised or more flexible in practice. But you can see the truth. Supervision exists, and so does creativity. You watch a young couple exchange glances that carry more meaning than a whole paragraph. A mother notices and pretends not to, because sometimes control is best applied gently. Or maybe she notices and does not pretend, and suddenly the couple is asked to carry something heavy together, right in the middle of the room, where everyone can see them and interpret everything. Social pressure is an art form. And then there's the subtle rebellion of silence. In a room where gratitude is expected to be spoken, a person who stays quiet can be making a statement. Maybe they're shy, maybe they're tired, maybe they're holding grief that doesn't fit the holiday's cheerful shape. Maybe they're resisting the performance. The room might let it pass, or the room might press them gently until they say something. Anything that sounds like gratitude. The holiday loves its script. Joke number 3. You realize Thanksgiving is basically a group project, and everyone is being graded on participation. The evening goes on, and manners keep doing their work. Even laughter follows rules. Even jokes are measured. But the longer people sit together, the more the edges soften. Someone tells a story and gets genuinely loud laughter. A child falls asleep in a chair, head tilted back, mouth open, and nobody even scolds them because that's the sweetest kind of defeat. Someone starts humming. Someone else joins. The formal becomes familiar. Historians still argue about how quickly American society in this period was shifting toward more middle-class ideals of respectability and self-control. But Thanksgiving shows you a snapshot of that shift. People want to be seen as orderly. They want to be seen as grateful. They want to be seen as decent. And yet, underneath, they are still hungry, still petty, still funny, still longing for a second slice of pie. You sit in the middle of it, watching the tiny rebellions sparkle and fade, and you feel something oddly comforting. These people, 200 years ago, are not stiff historical figures. They are the same as your family in the ways that count. They are trying to behave. They are trying to connect. They are trying to enjoy themselves without making a mess of the social fabric. And as the candlelight deepens and the voices soften, you realize the true tradition isn't the menu or the centerpiece or the decorations. It's the balancing act, the eternal human challenge of being polite while also being real, of honoring the day while still sneaking that extra bite when nobody's looking. Somewhere between the last crumb of pie and the first real yawn of the evening, the drinks start doing their quiet work. Not in a wild, modern party way, but in the slow, social lubricant way that makes people talk a little more, laugh a little easier, and reveal just enough opinion to keep the room interesting. You notice it first in the vessels. a jug brought out with casual care, a bottle set down without fanfare, a cup refilled when someone thinks you've been sitting too politely, and you realize Thanksgiving in 1826 has its own beverage lineup, one that's practical, local, and slightly judgmental depending on who's holding it. Here is the mainstream historical fact that anchors the moment. In early 19th century America, alcoholic and non-alcoholic drinks like cider, beer, rum, whiskey, coffee, and tea are common, with patterns varying by region, religion, and household norms. Temperance ideas are also growing in this period, shaping attitudes toward drinking. So yes, people drink, but also, yes, some people are already side-eyeing drinking as if it's the first domino in a moral collapse. Hard cider is a frequent guest at the table, especially in apple-growing regions. Apples are abundant, and cider is a way of turning them into a drink that stores and travels better than fresh fruit. It's often safer than questionable water sources too, which is a real and unglamorous factor in historical beverage choices. Cider can be mild or strong depending on fermentation and storage. You take a sip and it tastes like autumn with a little bite. Sweet at first and then sharp. It warms the throat in a way that feels like someone lit a tiny fire inside you. If the household has beer, it might be homemade, brewed in small batches. Nothing fizzy and branded, more like liquid bread. If they have spirits, it could be rum, whiskey, or something locally distilled. But spirits are treated differently. In some homes, they're served with caution, as a medicinal fortifier or a special occasion offering. In others, they're poured more freely, especially among men who consider a small burn in the chest a sign of strength. And then there's coffee. Coffee exists and is increasingly popular by the early 1800s. But availability depends on trade and money. If the household has it, it's a point of comfort and perhaps a little pride. The coffee is not your modern bright, carefully sourced pour-over. It's often strong, sometimes bitter, sometimes sweetened if sugar is available. It smells rich, almost smoky, and it pulls people's eyelids open when the candlelight is trying to close them. Tea can appear too, though it carries its own history and meaning in America, not that long after the Revolution. By 1826, tea is still consumed widely, but depending on family memory and politics, it might carry a faint echo of earlier debates. Mostly, though, it's just tea, warm, calming, familiar. Now here's your quirky tidbit. Some families sweeten drinks or desserts with coffee substitutes made from roasted grains or roots, like roasted barley or chicory, especially when imported coffee is expensive or unavailable. So you might be sipping something dark and warming that smells like coffee and sort of tastes like coffee, but is actually the household's clever substitute. It's a reminder that even comfort is sometimes improvised. Joke number 1. You realize people in 1826 invented off-brand coffee, and nobody even made a meme about it. Tragic. As cups circulate, the room's mood shifts. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Someone who was quiet at the table starts talking more. Someone who was stiff about manners loosens into a story. Someone drops an opinion they have clearly been saving, like a piece of candy hidden in a pocket. And the opinions are plentiful. It starts with harmless stuff. The apples were better last year. The road is worse than it used to be. That new family in town seems decent. Then it drifts. Politics, religion, the local economy. Who is prospering and why? Who is struggling and why? Thanksgiving is a time when relatives who haven't seen each other get updates, and updates come with interpretation. One person's misfortune is another person's poor planning. One person's hard work is another person's good luck. The cider doesn't create these opinions. It just helps them step into the light. Historians still argue whether temperance movements gain traction primarily because of genuine social harms from alcohol or because of broader cultural shifts toward self-control and middle-class respectability. But you can feel that tension at the table. Some people treat drink as normal, even healthy in moderation. Others treat it as a temptation that needs watching. A woman might refill a cup of coffee with brisk approval, while glancing at the cider jug like it's suspicious. A minister, if present, might accept a small drink without comment, or might politely decline and set a quiet standard. Either way, everyone notices. You also see how drinks are gendered in subtle ways. Men might gather with cider or spirits, talking louder, telling bigger stories. Women might cluster with tea or coffee, talking in quieter, sharper detail. This isn't universal, but it's common enough to shape the room's flow. And of course, there are rebels who cross those lines with calm confidence. A woman might take a sip of cider and keep talking, as if daring anyone to object. A man might sit with tea and act like it's purely medicinal. The drink becomes part of identity performance. Joke number 2. You realize, what are you drinking? Has always been code for what kind of person are you. As the night deepens, coffee becomes the anchor for those who want to stay awake and social. The aroma keeps the room lively. If someone has brought sugar, little spoons clink. If not, people drink it plain and accept bitterness as character building. Meanwhile, the cider continues to warm cheeks and soften edges. Laughter grows easier. Stories get slightly more exaggerated. The cow that escaped earlier in the year becomes, in retelling, a beast of mythic stubbornness. The storm becomes more dramatic. The near disaster becomes a comedy. At the same time, the drink does not erase the moral framework. People still watch themselves. Nobody wants to be the one who tips too far and becomes a cautionary tale. The holiday is community, and community remembers. The fear of embarrassment is a powerful temperance tool all by itself. Now, in this cozy, candle-lit hum, you notice how beverages function like pacing. Cider to loosen, coffee to sharpen, tea to soothe, water to reset. The house is managing the mood the way the kitchen managed the fire. Carefully, by feel. Joke number 3 lands softly as you take another sip and think, with sleepy admiration, that this is basically the original third place culture. No cafes, no bars as a casual hangout for everyone. Just a farmhouse living room and a jug that turns relatives into conversationalists. Eventually, the cups empty and the voices soften. Someone stops refilling and starts stacking. Someone brings out a basin for washing. The drinks have done their work. The room is warmer. Not just from fire, but from the way people have opened up. You've heard opinions. You've heard gossip. You've heard gratitude and complaints braided together, because that's what people do when they're full and tired and surrounded by family. And as the night starts to drift towards sleep again, you feel how these beverages are part of the holiday's rhythm. Not a wild celebration, not a dry ceremony, but something in between. Enough warmth to carry the conversation. Enough restraint to keep respectability intact. Enough bitterness, in the coffee or in the talk, to remind everyone that life is not only sweetness. You settle back, the candlelight flickering, and you listen to the room breathe around you, warmed by cider, steadied by coffee, and held together by the slow, familiar exchange of cups and opinions. The drinks have loosened everyone just enough that the room starts turning into a little newspaper made of voices. You can feel it happen. Someone leans forward, lowers their tone, and suddenly you are not just hearing about gravy and weather. You're hearing about the wider world, filtered through distance, rumor, and whatever the last traveler swore was true. In 1826, news does not arrive as a push notification. It arrives as a person, tired from the road, telling you what they think they saw. A guest mentions a town 2 counties over. Another mentions a ship that came in. Someone brings up a price at market, as if it's a moral event. Wheat costs this. Salt costs that. Coffee is dear. Cloth is scarce. You realize that news here is not only politics. It's the heartbeat of survival. What things cost, what's available, and how the world beyond your fence line is shifting. Here is the mainstream historical fact that shapes this whole exchange. In the early 19th century, many Americans get news through a mix of local newspapers, letters carried by post riders, and word of mouth through travelers, with information traveling slowly and often unevenly. That means Thanksgiving gatherings become natural news hubs, because relatives and neighbors bring updates from other places. You're basically sitting inside an analog group chat, except everyone talks at once and you can't mute your uncle. Joke number 1 lands quietly as you realize the breaking news alert is just a man clearing his throat and saying, "Now, I heard somebody has a newspaper, maybe folded and slightly greasy from being handled too much. It might be days or weeks old, but it doesn't matter. It's still the wider world in ink. They read parts aloud, because not everyone reads easily, and because reading aloud turns information into a shared event. The room listens in pockets. One person reacts sharply. Another hums in agreement. Someone else says, "I don't trust that," which is basically the first comment section. Politics creeps in, as it always does when people are full and feeling brave. They mention the president, elections, parties, speeches, local officials. Names and issues drift through the room like smoke. Even if some people claim they don't care for politics, they still care about what politics does to taxes, land, and trade. The tone can change quickly here, depending on who is present and how the household prefers to keep peace. Historians still argue whether Thanksgiving gatherings in the early Republic functioned more as civic rituals that reinforced shared national identity, or more as local and family events that only occasionally touched national politics. Listening to this room, you can see why the debate exists. The conversation swings between our town and the country, like a lantern in the wind. Then come the stories that sound half true and fully entertaining. Somebody swears there's a new kind of machine being used in a distant mill, something that can do work faster than any man. Another person scoffs, then immediately asks how much it costs, which is the purest form of skepticism. Someone mentions canal projects and roads, the idea that America is being stitched together with water and dirt, and you realize this era is full of motion. People are moving west, goods are moving farther, news is moving with them, slowly, like a cart on a muddy road. The room also trades local news, which is somehow even more intense. Who married whom? Who had a baby? Who lost a barn? Who is sick? Who is doing well? Who is pretending to do well? You hear someone mention a neighbor's illness in that careful tone that is half compassion and half fear. Because sickness is never just about one person. It's about whether it spreads, whether it returns, whether it takes someone who can't be spared. Here's your quirky tidbit, slipped into the conversation with the casualness of a person who doesn't realize it's fascinating. Sometimes news is carried not just by people, but by objects. A scrap of printed paper used to wrap something. A broadside posted in a town and copied by memory. A letter passed around until the folds nearly tear. You might even see someone keep a little bundle of clippings, saved like treasures, because paper itself has value and information feels like power. It's a reminder that media is physical here. You can hold it, you can lose it. You can spill cider on it and ruin your entire week. Joke number 2. You look at a single newspaper being shared by 10 people and think, wow, the subscription model really used to mean something. As the talk widens, you hear about weather beyond your own sky. Someone reports an early snow in another region. Someone says a river froze sooner than usual. Another person says the winter might be hard, and the room goes a little quieter because winter predictions are not small talk. They are planning. They are fear. They are the calendar turning its stern face toward you. Economic news keeps bubbling up. Crop yields, especially the price of corn, the price of flour, the cost of shipping. If someone in the room has visited a city, their details land like exotic stories. More people, more noise. Shops full of goods. Streets crowded with strangers. And then someone who has never left the county asks a simple question, like, is it worth it? That question hangs in the air, because it's not only about the city, it's about change, about whether the future is worth the trouble of reaching it. You start hearing about the frontier, too. Someone's cousin moved west. Someone's brother wrote a letter from a new settlement. The tales sound like equal parts promise and warning. Land is cheaper. They say, land is richer. They say, but it's lonely. It's dangerous. It's work stacked on work. Thanksgiving becomes a time when those letters are read aloud, when families collectively imagine their loved ones far away and try to make the distance feel smaller. Historians still argue whether westward migration in this era was driven more by economic pressure in established regions or by the pull of opportunity and ideology. But the room doesn't need the argument phrased like a book. The room lives it. You can hear both motives in the same breath. There was nothing for him here, and he wanted more. Sometimes the news is lighter, but still telling. A traveling peddler came through selling ribbons. A new school teacher arrived. A local church is fundraising. A barn dance is planned. These details feel small, but they build the picture of community life, where everyone is interconnected and nothing stays secret for long. Joke number 3 arrives when you realize the entire town's gossip system runs on one basic infrastructure. People drinking warm beverages and refusing to mind their business. At some point, someone brings up a recent public event, maybe a speech, maybe a local dispute, maybe something about tariffs or trade that has trickled down into prices. The room divides gently into opinions. You notice how people argue differently here. Not always loudly, but persistently. They cite what they heard, who said it, what the paper printed, what their cousin swears is true. Evidence is personal. Authority is social. You can almost see how misinformation can grow legs. But you can also see how corrections happen, when someone with better information speaks up and the room adjusts. And through it all, you feel the particular emotional undercurrent of news in this time. Uncertainty. The country is young. The economy shifts. Transportation changes. Disease comes and goes. A person's fortunes can rise or collapse on weather, market prices, or a single accident with a wagon wheel. The news is not entertainment. It is a weather report for life. As the evening wears on, the flow of information slows and becomes more reflective. People circle back to what matters most: who is safe, who is not, what the winter might bring, what they hope for next year. The holiday's gratitude theme sneaks back in here, not as forced performance, but as a quiet acknowledgement that in a world this unpredictable, having a full house and a full table feels like winning a small war. You sit in the candlelit room, listening to voices braid together into a living map of the era. The outside world has entered the farmhouse without ever opening a door, carried on tongues and paper and memory. And as you lean back, tired and warm, You realize that this is part of what Thanksgiving is doing in 1826. It's connecting isolated households into something larger, a web of stories, warnings, hopes, and shared reality. The room is warm, full, and talkative. And then you feel the air change when the holiday's deeper story brushes the surface. It doesn't always arrive as a direct statement. Sometimes it's a pause, a careful choice of words, a tradition repeated without explanation, a child reciting a simplified story they've been taught, or an adult making a comment that tries to sound innocent but carries old assumptions inside it. This is the part of Thanksgiving that doesn't sit neatly on the tablecloth. The indigenous presence is not a cute background detail in 1826. It's a living, complicated reality, and the holiday stories people tell are already starting to blur, polish, and omit. Here is the mainstream historical fact that you can't ignore. By the 1820s, indigenous peoples across the United States are experiencing intense pressure from settler expansion, treaties that often favor U.S. interests, forced displacement in many regions, and ongoing conflict and negotiation. New England tribes have already faced centuries of upheaval, and in other parts of the country, removal policies and frontier violence are accelerating. Thanksgiving gatherings might not speak about this directly, but the national context is there, shaping land ownership, settlement patterns, and the very harvest being celebrated. You look around the room and you notice something unsettling in its quietness. People talk about the land as if it has always belonged to them. They talk about clearing it, taming it, making it productive. And those words feel normal to them. But those words contain a whole history of who was pushed aside, who was negotiated with, who was ignored, who died, who survived. The holiday's gratitude is real, but it's also layered over a foundation that isn't evenly shared. Sometimes someone mentions native people directly, but not with the clean, careful language you'd use now. The era's vocabulary is blunt and often disrespectful. You hear terms that make you wince internally, and you notice how people talk about indigenous communities as if they're either a distant past or a vague frontier rumor, even when that isn't true. That's one of the tricks of settler society, turning the present into the past by force of narrative. Historians still argue whether early Thanksgiving traditions intentionally created a myth of harmonious origins or whether that myth developed later and was retroactively applied. But you can feel the myth-making process starting even here. A story gets told about the first Thanksgiving, and it comes out simplified, friendly, neat. The hard parts are sanded down. The tensions are smoothed. The listener is invited to feel comfort instead of complexity. And you notice who tells the story. Often it's an elder, or someone educated, or someone who wants the holiday to mean something uplifting. They're not necessarily trying to lie. They're repeating what they've absorbed. They're choosing a version that makes sense in a room full of children and relatives who want warmth. Not moral knots, but there are hints of the real world in small details. A dish made from corn, beans, or squash appears and someone refers to it with a casual Indian label, as if the ingredients just floated into the household from nowhere. The food on the table carries indigenous agricultural knowledge, yet the people who developed and sustained that knowledge are not honored in the same way the harvest is. It's like praising a song while refusing to name the musician. Here's your quirky tidbit. And it lands strangely because it's both fascinating and heavy. Some indigenous communities in New England and elsewhere have their own harvest and Thanksgiving traditions, rooted in seasonal cycles and spiritual practices that long predate European settlement. So when settlers proclaim a Thanksgiving, they're not inventing gratitude. They're layering their own religious and cultural framing onto a continent that already has deep traditions of giving thanks to the earth, to the seasons, to the Creator, to community. Two different systems of meaning exist in the same landscape, but one system is being politically and culturally pushed aside. Joke number 1. Gentle but real. You realize the settlers are acting like they invented gratitude, which is like showing up late to a potluck and claiming you invented food. The discomfort deepens when you consider who is in the area in 1826. Depending on the region, indigenous people might still live nearby, sometimes on small parcels, sometimes in communities under pressure, sometimes traveling for work or trade. In some towns, native people are hired for labor, or they sell crafts, baskets, or goods. Sometimes they are spoken about as neighbors, sometimes as outsiders. Sometimes they are visible. Sometimes they are made invisible by local storytelling. Thanksgiving gatherings can amplify that invisibility because the holiday is about narrative, about origin stories, about belonging. And the dominant story makes settlers the main characters. It frames the land as a reward for effort. It frames indigenous people, when mentioned at all, as either helpers in the distant past or obstacles in the present. That framing is powerful, and it shapes how children grow up understanding the country. Historians still argue about the accuracy and motivations behind the later popularized Pilgrims and Indians tableau, but you don't need to wait for later to see how it could happen. You can hear how a complex history becomes a digestible morality play. The room wants a story that fits the holiday mood, and complexity is inconvenient. At the same time, you notice something else. Not everyone in the room is comfortable with the simplistic version. A person might shift uncomfortably when certain comments are made. Someone might quietly correct a detail. Someone might mention a local native family in a way that feels more grounded, less mythic. These moments are subtle. They don't become arguments, usually, but they exist. The room contains multiple levels of awareness. Then the conversation drifts toward land again, and you hear the language of ownership and destiny. People talk about expansion west, about opportunities, about opening new territory. You can almost feel the nation's momentum pressing through the farmhouse walls. And you know, even if this room doesn't say it directly, that these conversations sit in the shadow of policies and conflicts that will shape indigenous lives dramatically in this period. Joke number 2. Quiet and sleepy, but pointed. You realize Thanksgiving in 1826 is sometimes like a cozy blanket draped over a very sharp table edge. It feels warm, but you can still feel what's underneath if you shift the wrong way. You also see how religion interacts with these narratives. Some people interpret expansion and settlement as part of a divine plan. They frame success as blessing, and blessing as proof. That can make it harder to question the moral cost. If prosperity equals divine favor, then the suffering of others can be rationalized as unfortunate but inevitable, or worse, deserved. This is not every household's mindset, but it exists, and it shapes the cultural atmosphere. Meanwhile, the actual presence of indigenous influence continues through practical things. Place names, trails, farming techniques adopted and adapted, foods, even the use of certain plants as medicines, knowledge sometimes borrowed without credit. The landscape itself is a living archive of indigenous presence, whether settlers acknowledge it or not. Historians still argue about how much early American identity was built through appropriation and reinvention of indigenous symbols and practices. But in this room, you can see the early outlines, the way people borrow a food, a word, a story, and then fold it into their own tradition while pushing the original context to the margins. As the evening quiets, the holiday's gratitude theme returns, and it becomes even more complicated. Gratitude for harvest, gratitude for family, gratitude for survival, all real, and yet gratitude can coexist with blind spots. It can coexist with stories that comfort the majority while erasing the minority. It can coexist with a sense of belonging that was built, in part, by making someone else's belonging harder. You sit with that, not as a lecture, but as a texture in the room, candlelight flickering, faces tired, voices softening. The holiday is still happening, but you can feel the layers beneath it, like rings in a tree. And as you listen to the last bits of conversation drift toward sleep, you understand something important about what Thanksgiving was really like 200 years ago. It wasn't a single, clean story. It was a lived day inside a society that was building itself, proudly and painfully at the same time. The table could be full, the prayers sincere, the laughter genuine, and the omissions still real. The fire crackles low, the room settles, and you carry that complexity with you, like a quiet stone in your pocket, as the holiday night continues. The stone in your pocket gets heavier when you follow the holiday's thread into the next uncomfortable room. Because if Thanksgiving in 1826 is a day of gratitude and gathering, it is also, for many households, a day where the question of who gets to rest becomes painfully clear. The feast is a display of abundance, but abundance is not shared evenly, and the labor behind the abundance is not equally recognized. You notice it in who is still moving while others are seated, who clears plates, who washes, who carries water, who stokes the fire, who stands near the doorway, ready to respond before anyone even asks. In some homes, this labor is done by daughters and women of the household, expected and unpaid. In others, it is done by hired servants. In others, especially in parts of the United States where slavery is entrenched, it is done by enslaved people who have no choice, no holiday, and no claim to the gratitude being spoken. Here is the mainstream historical fact that grounds this section, even if the room doesn't want to say it out loud. Slavery remains legal in the United States in 1826 and is a central feature of life and economy in the South and present in other ways across the country. Domestic service and household labor, whether enslaved or free, often underpins large meals and social gatherings. Thanksgiving, where celebrated, can still occur inside these systems, meaning the same holiday can feel radically different depending on who you are. You feel the contrast between the front room and the kitchen in a sharper way now. The front room holds the performance, prayer, conversation, gratitude. The kitchen holds the cost, heat, sweat, endless dishes, and the fact that a celebration creates more work than ordinary days. If the household has help, that help absorbs the load so the hosts can appear serene. If the household doesn't, then the women and older children absorb it. Either way, somebody is paying for the feast with their hands and their time. You step closer to the kitchen door and you see the evidence. Piles of plates, grease congealing in pans, pots that need scrubbing before residue hardens like cement, water that must be warmed again and again because there is no endless hot tap. Someone's arms are wet up to the elbows. Someone's shoulders are tense. Someone is too tired to join the laughter in the next room. Joke number 1. Small and bittersweet. You realize the original post-holiday cleanup has always been the same, except now it involves hauling water like you're auditioning for a survival documentary. If the household is in a slave-holding region, the dynamics can be even more stark. Enslaved cooks and domestic workers may have prepared much of the meal, served it, and then cleaned it, all while the people at the table speak of blessings and gratitude. Some enslaved people might be permitted small portions of leftovers, or given a brief pause, or allowed to see family on certain holidays, depending on the owner and the local norms. But any allowance is conditional. It is not a right. It can be withdrawn. The holiday can become a cruel mirror, celebration for some, enforced labor for others. Historians still argue whether holidays like Thanksgiving could function as a moments of limited respite for enslaved communities, or whether they mostly reinforced power hierarchies by showcasing the enslaver's wealth and benevolence. You can sense the complexity without romanticizing it. In some cases, any extra food or time would matter, because any extra food or time matters when you have none. But the structure remains. One group rests because another group cannot. Even in non-slaveholding households, domestic service can create a similar contrast, though not identical in moral weight. A hired servant might work through the holiday because that's their job, and their ability to refuse is limited by economics. They might eat in the kitchen, they might eat later, they might never sit at the main table. Gratitude speeches rarely include them by name. You notice, too, the gendered labor patterns that cut across regions. Women are expected to orchestrate the meal, manage the house, and make hospitality look effortless. Men might carve the meat, say the prayer, host the conversation. The division isn't universal, but it's common enough to shape the holiday's texture. Even when everyone is kind, the workload is uneven. Here's your quirky tidbit, sharp and telling. Some household manuals and advice literature of the era talk openly about how a well-managed home should run smoothly during entertaining, emphasizing the mistress's role in organizing servants and timing meals so that guests are impressed. In other words, domestic labor is a skill set that is socially rewarded when it is invisible. The more perfect the holiday looks, the more hidden the labor often becomes. Joke number 2. You realize the original "it just came together" line is a lie that's been passed down like an heirloom. In the kitchen, you help with something simple, because you can't just stand there watching. You dry dishes, you scrape, you carry water. You feel the ache in your hands again. The cold water, the rough cloth, the stubborn grease. You also feel the silence. The kitchen can be quieter, not because people aren't talking, but because the work demands focus. The laughter from the front room floats in like distant music from a party you weren't invited to. And yet, there is also community here. The people working together exchange small jokes, quick comments, soft sympathy, a shared eye roll, a whispered, "Can you believe how much they ate?" This is the backstage, and backstage always has its own culture. Historians still argue about how household labor shaped family relationships and social structures in early America. But you can see it plainly. A daughter learns competence under pressure. A servant learns the household's rhythms. An enslaved cook carries knowledge of flavors and timing that the household depends on, even if that knowledge is never credited. Food traditions can be maintained by the very people denied credit for them. That irony is heavy. You also notice that rest isn't evenly distributed within the working group either. Older children might be expected to keep going longer. Younger ones are sent to bed. A woman who has been cooking since dawn might finally sit for a moment, then stand again because there's still bread to wrap, still bones to set aside, still fat to store, still a floor to sweep. Thanksgiving creates leftovers, and leftovers are work too. They must be preserved correctly or they become waste. Waste is not an option. In slaveholding households, the day after the feast can be particularly grim. The celebration ends, and the routine of forced labor continues, unchanged. Any extra food might be consumed quickly because there's no guarantee of future abundance. Any family gathering among enslaved people might be limited by distance and permissions. The holiday might remind them of what they cannot have. Autonomy, rest, public gratitude. You sit with that reality without turning it into spectacle. Because the point isn't to add drama. The point is to tell the truth of what really like means. A holiday is not experienced in one way. It is experienced through position, power, and circumstance. Joke number 3. Quiet and gentle to keep the tone from getting too heavy. You think about modern Thanksgiving arguments over who does the dishes, and you realize those debates are, in a strange way, a privilege. Having the option to argue about fairness means you live in a world where fairness is at least imaginable. As the work finally slows, you feel the house settle again. Plates stacked, pots rinsed, the hearth cleaned up. The kitchen returns to something like calm. Someone sighs, the kind of sigh that comes from finishing a marathon no one applauded. Then they straighten their back and step toward the front room, because the performance continues, hospitality continues, the holiday continues. And you understand, in a deeper way now, that Thanksgiving 200 years ago is both warmth and work, both community and hierarchy. It can be sincere gratitude and also selective gratitude. Gratitude that praises blessings while ignoring the people who made them possible. The feast is real. The labor is real. The imbalance is real. The candlelight flickers lower. The voices in the front room soften. The kitchen finally breathes. And you carry the truth of it with you, not to ruin the holiday, but to see it clearly, as a day stitched together by many hands, not all of them free to rest. When the hardest truths settle, the holiday keeps moving anyway, because that's what living does. The house doesn't freeze into a moral lecture. It drifts back into the practical, into the sensory, into the way food and conversation keep carrying people forward. And now you start tasting the country, not as one nation with one Thanksgiving, but as a patchwork of regions, each one stubbornly convinced their way is normal. You can almost feel the map unfold in the room as guests talk about how we do it back home. The phrase is said casually, but it's a clue. Thanksgiving in 1826 is not a single tradition marching in formation. It's a cluster of local customs, immigrant habits, and survival strategies, all borrowing from each other and pretending they're original. Here is the mainstream historical fact that sets the stage. In the early 19th century, Thanksgiving observances are more established in New England than in much of the South and West, and food traditions vary strongly by region based on climate, agriculture, local economies, and the cultural backgrounds of settlers and immigrants. That means what's on the table and how the day is framed can change dramatically depending on where you're standing. If you're in New England, the feast often leans into what stores well and what the region produces. Roasted meats. Yes. Root vegetables. Squash. Apple dishes everywhere. Cranberries more likely than in other places. Because they're gathered locally and they're tart enough to cut through heavy food. Breads might include wheat bread if the household has flour, but cornmeal is still present because corn is reliable. Desserts are often pie-heavy, and the pies taste like orchards and molasses. Now imagine the mid-Atlantic, and the table starts shifting. More diversity in ingredients thanks to markets and ports. More influence from Dutch, German, and other immigrant foodways. You might see sauerkraut or pickled cabbage. You might see baked goods that reflect German baking traditions. There could be more varied cheeses, more use of spices if trade access is better. A meal might include dishes that feel less Pilgrim storybook and more busy port city pantry. If you drift south, the whole flavor palette changes again. Corn is still king, but it becomes cornbread in different styles, grits, and other preparations. Sweet potatoes can appear more prominently than white potatoes. Greens might show up, cooked down into something rich and soft. Pork is a major celebratory meat, and smoked or cured forms are common. In some areas, rice becomes important, especially in coastal regions where rice cultivation is established. And in the South, The presence of enslaved African Americans profoundly shapes cuisine, introducing and sustaining techniques and flavors that will define American food long after the holiday's over. Historians still argue about how much American regional cuisines formed through melting pot, blending versus parallel traditions that only later mixed more widely. But Thanksgiving tables show you both patterns at once. Some families borrow, some cling, some blend without realizing they're blending. Out on the frontier, the feast becomes even more improvisational. There might be less ceremony, more necessity. A family might call a day Thanksgiving simply because they survived the year, harvested enough, and have neighbors close enough to share food with. Game meats can be more common. Corn and squash still anchor things, because they grow well and store well. The desserts might be simpler, or they might be intensely creative, because boredom and scarcity breed invention. Here's your quirky tidbit. And it's one of those details that makes history feel oddly alive. Some immigrant communities bring their own harvest celebrations and simply fold them into the American calendar. A German family might treat the gathering with their own baking traditions and preserved foods. A Dutch-influenced household might bring different spicing and sweets. An Irish family might emphasize certain breads or stews. These foods don't always get labeled as immigrant at the table. They just become what we eat. Over time, the origin gets blurry, and the dish becomes local tradition. Joke number 1. You realize authentic, traditional Thanksgiving has been a moving target since day one, which means you are free, spiritually, to put whatever you want on your plate forever. As you listen to guests compare notes, you notice how even the meaning of the day changes by region. In New England, it often has that official, proclaimed feel, tied to church and state declarations. In other places, it might be more like a family feast without the formal proclamation, or it might not be observed at all in the same way. Some communities have other harvest celebrations, other calendars, other names. Thanksgiving is not yet the national holiday you assume it is. It's a regional habit spreading slowly. Food reflects this uneven spread. One person might talk about pumpkin pie as essential. Another might shrug and say they've never had it. Someone might insist turkey is the centerpiece. Another might laugh and say they've always done goose. Someone might mention oysters and stuffing, and the room reacts as if they've suggested putting a fish in a hat. But in some coastal areas, that's normal. The ocean is right there. Of course, the ocean wants to join dinner. Joke number 2. You picture a turkey and an oyster negotiating for custody of the stuffing, and you decide you need less cider. The dishes on the table also reflect access to markets. A household near a city might have more variety, imported spices, refined sugar, coffee. A rural household might lean on molasses, maple sugar, homegrown herbs, dried fruit. A coastal household might have fish and shellfish. An inland household might have more game. Even within the same region, class matters. Wealthy households can purchase ingredients that make the feast more elaborate. Poor households might celebrate with simpler foods, but the celebration is still meaningful if it represents abundance relative to their normal scarcity. Historians still argue about whether Thanksgiving's later standard menu emerged primarily from New England cultural influence, from media and literature, or from practical agricultural commonalities across the country. Sitting here in 1826, you can see why New England would dominate the story, because it has the most established Thanksgiving proclamations and a strong narrative tradition. But you can also see how other regions have their own logic and would eventually contribute. The future standard isn't inevitable. It's a result of whose story gets told loudest. You taste that future forming in small moments. A guest who recently traveled talks about how another town does it, and the family listens. Curious. Someone tries a new dish and likes it. Someone mentions a recipe from a relative. And suddenly the recipe becomes part of this household's tradition. This is how food culture moves, not with official announcements, but with mouths and memory. As the night continues, you feel the comfort of regional identity. People are proud of their dishes, proud of their methods, proud of their way of making the day feel special. Even when they borrow and then claim it as how we've always done it. Because that's how humans work. Tradition is often just old, borrowing with confidence. Joke number 3. You realize your family's ancient recipe is probably just a neighbor's idea from 1819 that everyone forgot was borrowed. And honestly, that's kind of beautiful. The room softens again as the talk becomes less comparative and more reflective. Everyone, regardless of region, is trying to do the same thing. Mark a turning point in the year. Gather, eat, share. Remember who they are to each other. Prepare emotionally for winter. And you, sitting there, feel the country as a collage rather than a single picture. A Thanksgiving that tastes like apples and cranberries in one place, like rice and pork in another, like game and corn on the edge of settlement, like immigrant baking in a bustling port town. No football, no parades, no unified menu. Just people taking what they have, mixing it with who they are, and calling it celebration. The candlelight flickers lower. The house quiets, and the regional flavors linger on your tongue like accents. You can't pin Thanksgiving down to one recipe here, because it isn't one. It's many, all at once, moving slowly toward the version you think you know, but still stubbornly local for now. The night feels softer now, but your body has its own opinion about how much you ate. You can tell because the room is quieting, people are settling, and yet somewhere inside you, your stomach is holding a meeting. It's not a crisis meeting. It's more like a strongly worded complaint. And in 1826, when you overdo it, you don't reach for a chewable tablet with a smiley face on the bottle. You reach for whatever your household believes will fix you, which can be practical, bizarre, or both. Because medicine, digestion, and folk fixes are woven into the holiday in a way you probably don't expect. People know overeating happens. They anticipate it. They even treat it like part of the ritual. But their remedies come from a world where the pharmacy is the pantry, the garden, and a small cabinet of bottles with handwritten labels. Here is the mainstream historical fact that frames this section. In the early 19th century, many Americans rely on a mix of home remedies, herbal medicine, and professional medical practices that can include purging, bloodletting, and tonics, with medical knowledge still developing and access to trained physicians varying by region and class. Digestive discomfort is common after feasts, and people often use bitters, teas, and simple household treatments to soothe it. You shift in your chair and someone notices. Not in an intrusive way, but in that quick, knowing way elders have. Like they've been tracking your digestion since you were born. Too much, they say. Not as a question. And before you can deny it, someone offers you something warm and dark. It might be peppermint tea. Peppermint is a classic. It grows, it stores, it smells clean, and it's genuinely soothing. You take a sip and feel your stomach relax slightly, like it's unclenching a fist. Or it might be ginger, if the household has access to it, perhaps in dried form. Ginger is prized for settling the belly. Or chamomile, or fennel. These are gentle options. The kind of remedies that feel like care rather than punishment. But remedies in 1826 are not always gentle. Someone might offer you bitters, a tincture meant to stimulate digestion. It tastes sharp, bitter, and medicinal in a way that makes your face involuntarily confess your feelings. Bitters can be herbal infusions in alcohol, and families might have their own blends. The bitter taste is part of the logic. Bitterness is believed to wake up your insides and get things moving. You swallow and try to look grateful, while your tongue quietly files for divorce. Joke number 1. You realize the original digestive aid is basically drink something that tastes like regret. Now here's your quirky tidbit, and it's one of those details that feels almost comical until you remember people are serious about it. Some households keep a remedy called catnip tea for stomach troubles and colic. Yes, catnip. The plant you associate with cats losing their minds is, for humans, a mild calming herb often used in folk medicine. So you might be sitting there, overfull, sipping something that smells faintly green and comforting, while the household cat watches you with judgment like, "That's my thing." Joke number 2. You lock eyes with the cat and silently agree never to speak of this. The conversation drifts into digestion like it's normal, because it is. People talk openly about feeling heavy or bilious, about needing something to settle. They are not shy about bodily functions in the way modern dinner tables sometimes pretend. Bodies don't exist. They are practical. They've lived through illness. They've seen people suffer. They know the line between discomfort and danger can be thinner in this era. If someone really feels bad, the remedies can escalate. Warm compresses, a little vinegar in water. Baking soda might be used in some homes, though access varies. A walk outside in cold air is prescribed like medicine because movement helps digestion and cold air clears the head. You see someone stand, wrap a shawl, and step into the yard for a few minutes, breathing deeply, letting the night reset them. The stars look sharp, and the cold feels like a clean slap. Historians still argue about how much early American medical practice helped versus harmed, especially with aggressive treatments like purging and bleeding. But in the realm of everyday digestion, a lot of remedies are simply about comfort and routine. Tea, rest, gentle movement. These can actually help. Then you hear someone mention physis, and the room reacts with a mix of respect and dread. Physic is a general term for medicine, often laxatives or purgatives meant to cleanse the system. In this era, people often believe that illness and discomfort come from imbalances or harmful substances in the body that need to be expelled. So the solution is to, well, expel. The idea of purging after overeating might sound extreme, but it fits the medical logic of the time. You feel your stomach behave better instantly, purely out of fear. Joke number 3. You discover your digestive system responds beautifully to psychological terror, which is not a wellness tip you wanted. On the more official medicine side, families with means might have access to a doctor, or at least to patent medicines and tonics sold widely in the period. Bottles of elixirs and cordials exist, often claiming to cure everything from indigestion to melancholy. Some contain alcohol, some contain opiates or other strong ingredients, though the household might not fully understand what's in them. People trust labels, tradition, and testimonials. The line between medicine and marketing is blurry, but most of the time, Thanksgiving digestion is handled in the kitchen and the herb bundle, not in a doctor's bag. The same hands that cook the feast now offer comfort after it. A warm mug, a gentle admonition. Next time, take less. Which is hilarious because everyone knows there will be no next time restraint. As the remedies do their work, the room settles into that particular post-feast calm. People sit with hands on stomachs. They sigh. They loosen collars. They talk more slowly. The candles flicker. The fire pops. Someone dozes with their head tilted back, and nobody moves to wake them because the nap is part of the recovery process. You start noticing other health-related quirks. Someone mentions that too much rich food can thicken the blood. Someone insists that a bit of vinegar keeps illness away. Someone claims that certain herbs protect against winter sickness. Some of these beliefs have a faint thread of truth. Some are superstition, and some are just the human need to feel control over a body that can betray you without warning. Historians still argue about how folk medicine traditions blended indigenous knowledge, European herbal practice, and African healing traditions in different regions. But you can see that blending in the remedies themselves. A plant used because someone's grandmother swore by it. A technique learned from a neighbor. A tea whose origin is half forgotten, but whose comfort is remembered. And you, sitting there, overfull but warming back into balance, feel the strange intimacy of it. This isn't modern individual discomfort handled privately in a bathroom with a phone. This is communal. People notice. People help. People offer remedies the way they offer extra blankets. Bodies are part of the household's shared responsibility. The night continues to slow. Your stomach settles into uneasy peace. The herbal tea warms your hands. The room's voices fade toward whispers. Outside, winter presses close. Inside, people treat indigestion as just another small hardship to manage with the same tools they manage everything else. Practicality, habit, and a little bit of strange tradition. And as you finally feel your body stop protesting, you realize something oddly comforting. Even 200 years ago, after all the work, all the food, all the heavy history, people still ended Thanksgiving the same way you do now. Too full, slightly sleepy, quietly promising they'll be more reasonable next time. And everyone knows they're lying. By morning, the feast has transformed into a different kind of treasure. Not the dramatic centerpiece moment, not the big reveal of pies, but the quiet wealth of what's left. Leftovers in 1826 are not a lazy bonus. They are a plan. They are the practical afterglow that stretches the holiday's abundance across days that will not be festive at all. You wake to the smell of reheating something, and it's instantly comforting. The house is calmer now. Guests may be gone or preparing to leave. The chatter has softened. The performance energy is fading. But the kitchen is still awake, because the kitchen never really sleeps. It just changes tasks. Here is the mainstream historical fact that frames everything you're about to see. In early 19th century households, food preservation and minimizing waste are essential for winter survival. And leftovers are often repurposed into new dishes, like soups, stews, hashes, pies, and puddings rather than simply reheated and eaten as is. Without modern refrigeration, timing and technique matter. The question isn't, what do we feel like eating? It's, what can we safely use, and how do we make it last? You follow someone into the kitchen and see the evidence of strategy. Meat has been set aside, covered, perhaps stored in the coolest spot available. In cold climates, a pantry or cellar might help keep things safe, especially as temperatures drop. In some homes, food is placed near a window or in an unheated room where the cold works like nature's refrigerator. But it's not foolproof. The household is racing the clock, managing spoilage with experience. The bones from yesterday's roast are already on their way to becoming broth. They're simmering gently with scraps of onion, maybe a few herbs, the kind of pot that turns leftovers into nourishment. The broth smells like comfort with a backbone. It will become soup. It will become gravy again. It will become the base for something that tastes like the holiday without requiring the full holiday effort. Then there's the bread. Stale bread is not sad here. Stale bread is opportunity. It becomes crumbs for thickening. It becomes fried slices. It becomes a bread pudding-like dish if there's milk and eggs. Or it becomes something simpler, soaked and warmed and made to feel special again. You watch someone cut bread with calm precision and realize they're not thinking leftovers. They're thinking inventory. Joke number 1. You realize meal prepping didn't start with gym bros. It started with people who did not want to starve in January. Meat leftovers are handled with respect. A thin slice of roast can stretch far when chopped into a hash with potatoes or turnips. Bits of turkey or goose can be mixed into a pie with gravy, vegetables, and a simple crust. Pork can be diced and added to beans. If there's fat saved, it's used to fry and enrich, turning humble ingredients into something satisfying. And the vegetables aren't just reheated, either. Squash becomes a mash, then becomes a filling. Root vegetables become soup, then become a thickened stew. Even pickles and relishes keep doing their job, cutting through richness and making repeat meals feel less monotonous. Here's your quirky tidbit for the leftovers era. Hash in this period is often a catch-all dish, a way of chopping leftover meat and mixing it with potatoes, onions, or whatever is available, fried in fat until crisp at the edges. It's cheap, filling, and versatile. And it's also the kind of dish that makes you realize leftovers can actually be better than the original meal, because the flavors have had time to settle together like roommates who finally stopped fighting. Joke number 2. You take a bite of leftover hash and think, wow, the true Thanksgiving winner is the next morning. The household is also thinking about waste in a broader way. Any drippings are saved, any grease is stored, bones are boiled, even the water used for certain cooking might be repurposed as broth. It's not glamorous, but it's smart. Winter is long, and hunger is a real threat for many families. A feast that wastes food would be not just foolish, but morally questionable. Waste is seen as disrespectful to the blessing. That moral framing ties right back into the gratitude you heard last night. Historians still argue about how much early American attitudes toward thrift were driven by religious belief versus economic necessity. But in practice, they're braided together. You don't waste because it's wrong, and you don't waste because it's dangerous. Both can be true at once. You watch how leftovers are distributed too. In some households, extra food might be shared with neighbors who are struggling, quietly delivered as charity. In others, the household hoards it because they need it. In many cases, it's a mix. Share what you can. Keep what you must. The holiday's community spirit extends beyond the table in these small acts. The kitchen itself has a different mood now, less frantic, more methodical. The fire still managed, but the stakes feel lower. Nobody is trying to time 3 pies and a roast at once. Instead, they're turning the feast into a series of manageable meals. It's quieter work, almost soothing, a kind of domestic aftercare. You help with something small, you stir broth, you chop an onion. Your hands remember yesterday's soot and effort. But today feels gentler. The air smells simpler too, more savory than celebratory, like the house is exhaling. Joke number 3. You realize the 1826 version of leftover containers is whatever bowl has a lid and doesn't leak. And suddenly, your modern Tupperware drawer seems less offensive. As the day moves on, the leftovers become a schedule, a little pie for breakfast, because why not and because calories are useful. Hash at midday, soup at night, a slice of bread with something spreadable in between. Everything planned to reduce labor while still feeding everyone well. And this is where you see the hidden genius of the Thanksgiving feast in this era. It's not only one day of abundance. It's a way of stocking up on cooked food, on ready calories, on comfort that can be stretched into the next week. The feast is an investment in ease. In a season where every meal normally demands constant work, having cooked meat and broth and bread already done is a small luxury that makes the following days feel lighter. Historians still argue about whether Thanksgiving's popularity grew partly because it functioned as a practical seasonal checkpoint for households. A moment to cook, preserve, and redistribute resources before winter tightened its grip. Sitting here with a bowl of broth warming your hands, you can see why that theory holds weight. This isn't just celebration, it's strategy with a happy face. Outside, the world is cold and bright. Inside, the house smells like simmering bones and reheated bread. People talk less now, because the visitors have gone and the work has returned. But there's a calm satisfaction in the routine. The holiday has passed, but it has left behind something tangible. Food that will carry you forward. You take another spoonful of soup and feel the warmth move through you slowly. The feast is no longer a spectacle. It's fuel. It's the quiet promise that for a few more days, at least, the pantry is generous and the household can breathe. And you realize that might be the most real part of Thanksgiving 200 years ago. Not the big table moment, but the careful stretching afterward. The way people turn one day's abundance into a week's steadiness, not by magic, but by planning, thrift, and a deep refusal to waste what winter will demand. By the time the leftovers have been folded into the household's rhythm, the holiday starts to feel like a glow rather than an event. The noise is gone. The guests have thinned out. The house is quieter in a way that makes the fire sound louder. Each crackle and pop suddenly important. Outside, the late afternoon light is already slipping away because November does not believe in long days. You can feel the calendar turning its stern face toward winter, and that makes the quiet gratitude at the end of Thanksgiving feel different, less performative, more like a private thought you don't say too loudly in case it disappears. You sit near the hearth, where warmth is not a background setting but a resource. The room smells faintly of broth and smoke and wool drying. Someone has swept the floor. Someone has stacked the last clean dishes. The kitchen looks tired but orderly, like a battlefield after the soldiers have gone home. And you, wrapped in layers, feel the body-deep calm of having eaten well and having done enough work to earn the rest. Here is the mainstream historical fact that gives this evening its particular weight. In the early 19th century, late autumn and winter bring real risk in rural life, including illness, accidents, and food scarcity. And many families measure their security by stored provisions, fuel, and community ties. Thanksgiving, where observed, functions as a pause to acknowledge survival and preparedness at a turning point in the year. The gratitude is not abstract. It's seasonal. The household settles into small rituals. Someone mends a seam by firelight, needle flashing in and out like a tiny lighthouse. Someone sharpens a tool because tomorrow the chores continue. A child leans against an adult, half asleep, their hair smelling like smoke and outdoors. The cat circles once and chooses a warm spot as if it owns the entire concept of comfort. You watch it curl up and think. Honestly, the cat is the wisest creature in the room. Joke number 1. You realize the true Thanksgiving tradition is being outsmarted by a cat who has contributed nothing but vibes. Conversation is quieter now, more reflective. People talk about what was good this year, a crop that came in, a relative who recovered, a roof that held, a birth, a safe return. They also talk about what was hard, but even that is said in a gentler tone, because naming hardship is safer when you've just proven, at least for now, that you made it through. There's a moment where someone looks toward the window, toward the darkness, and you can almost feel the thought behind their eyes. Winter will come no matter what. The Day of Thanks does not stop frost or sickness or broken wagons, but it does something else. It strengthens the little web that keeps people alive. Family, neighbors, shared work, shared food. Historians still argue whether the emotional core of early Thanksgiving was more religious devotion or communal resilience. But sitting here at nightfall, you can see how those merge. Prayer is one way of making sense of uncertainty. Community is another. Both are attempts to hold on to something steady when the world is not. The light keeps fading. Candles are lit again. Their glow makes the room smaller, softer, more intimate. Shadows lean into corners. The fire becomes a slow orange pulse. You hear wind outside, not violent, just present, reminding the house that it is surrounded by cold. Someone adds a log, and the flames brighten briefly, throwing warm light onto tired faces. And in that warm flicker, gratitude becomes less like a speech and more like a sensation. You feel it in your stomach, still warmed by broth. You feel it in your hands, no longer working. You feel it in the simple fact that you are indoors, sheltered, with enough fuel for tonight and enough food for tomorrow. Joke number 2. You realize your modern idea of cozy is basically a decorative candle and a playlist. And here it's not freezing to death, which really puts your throw blankets in perspective. People begin preparing for bed, not hurriedly, but with that steady, practiced rhythm. Water is set aside, doors are checked, the fire is banked so it will last, bedding is arranged. There's a quiet satisfaction in these routines, because routines are what carry you through seasons. Thanksgiving is a bright knot tied into the rope of daily life, but the rope keeps going. You find yourself thinking about the day, not as a list of dishes or events, but as a feeling. The early work, the heat of the kitchen, the crowded table, the stories, the difficult truths humming underneath, the strategy of leftovers, the way everything, even celebration, is bound to survival. Historians still argue about how much modern Thanksgiving has retained the original spirit of the holiday versus becoming a more commercial and nationalized ritual. But you can feel the seed of it here. The heart of it is not consumption for its own sake. It's relief. Relief that the year didn't break you. Relief that you have enough to share. Relief that, at least tonight, the world is held back by walls, fire, and people. A child yawns, huge and unself-conscious, and is carried or guided toward bed. Someone laughs softly, then quiets, as if laughter is too loud for the night's mood. The adults speak in lower voices, making small plans for tomorrow. Who will visit whom? What needs repairing? Whether the weather will change. Their faces are calmer now. The social performance over. The household returned to itself. Joke number 3 lands like a whisper. You realize the biggest luxury in 1826 is not dessert. It's silence after guests leave. You step closer to the fire and watch the embers glow. You listen to the house settling, the faint creaks and sighs of wood and cold air and human movement. It feels like the house is alive, breathing in time with the people inside it. You let your eyes linger on the simple objects, the iron pot, the folded cloth, the broom, the stacked wood. These are not props. They are the infrastructure of survival. And as night fully takes the landscape, you feel the holiday's final shape, not loud, not flashy, but deeply human. A moment of warmth held against a cold season. A shared meal that becomes shared memory. A pause that reminds everyone, quietly, that they are not alone. You settle into your bedding again, the room dim, the fire low, and you let the last thoughts drift through you like smoke. Gratitude in this era is not something you post or announce. It's something you feel in the dark, listening to the wind outside and the breathing of the household inside, and thinking, with calm relief, we made it this far. The quiet, after Thanksgiving, has a way of pulling your thoughts forward, toward what comes next. You've tasted the holiday in its early form, felt its work, its warmth, its contradictions, and now you can almost sense the future creeping in around the edges, the way a new season creeps in before you're ready. Because what you've lived here in 1826 isn't yet the single, national Thanksgiving, you know. It's a regional habit, a family ritual, a patchwork of proclamations and home feasts. But you can feel the ingredients of a bigger tradition gathering. Slowly, like clouds building for a storm that will one day be called the holidays. You sit near the hearth one last time, and you notice how people talk about the day. Not just we ate, but we kept the day. That phrasing matters. A day is kept the way you keep a promise, or keep a fire, or keep food through winter. It implies intention, and it implies repetition. The tradition is already being rehearsed, even if the nation hasn't agreed on the script yet. Here is the mainstream historical fact that guides you into the future. Throughout the 19th century, Thanksgiving becomes increasingly formalized and widespread in the United States, influenced by regional practices, especially New England, civic and religious proclamations, cultural storytelling, and later, national leadership that helped standardize the date and meaning. In 1826, you are in the still forming stage. In the decades ahead, the day will grow from a local observance into a national ritual, with a more fixed calendar and a more unified story. You can feel the forces that will push it there. Mobility is increasing. Roads and canals connect communities. Newspapers and printed culture spread ideas of what American traditions should look like. Families move, carry recipes, blend customs. A person raised on New England Thanksgiving habits moves somewhere else and says, "We should do it like this." And the idea takes root. It's not a single decision. It's thousands of small borrowings. And then there's the power of narrative. The first Thanksgiving story is already being shaped, simplified, and retold, because societies love origin myths the way children love bedtime stories. The myth gives a young nation a cozy beginning. It makes the past feel friendly. It also helps smooth over the uncomfortable parts you've been carrying like that stone in your pocket. Historians still argue whether the national Thanksgiving myth emerged more from deliberate cultural projects or from a gradual accumulation of popular retellings. But either way, you've heard the early echoes of it in this farmhouse. You imagine future classrooms, future children, future paper decorations. You can almost see how a complicated feast becomes a tidy tableau. Pilgrims, Indians, a table in the woods, smiles, harmony. It's a story designed to reassure, not to interrogate. And because it reassures, it spreads. But the holiday also spreads because it works. It does something useful for human beings. It makes a dark season feel shared. It creates a reason to travel, to reconnect, to pause. It gives communities a moment to measure their year and say, out loud, that survival matters. Joke number 1. You realize Thanksgiving becomes popular for the same reason leftovers become popular. It's comforting, practical, and it stretches. You think about the menu too. In 1826, it's flexible. But over time, certain foods start winning the cultural popularity contest. Turkey rises as the symbolic centerpiece because it's big enough for gatherings and distinct from everyday meats. Cranberries become part of the New England flavor pack that spreads with the myth. Pumpkin pie becomes the dessert shorthand for autumn. These foods are not invented later, but they become standardized later, elevated into national icons. Food has a way of turning into identity when enough people repeat it. The holiday's tone shifts too. Right now, the day carries a strong religious and communal pressure in many places. In the future, for many families, it will become more secular, more centered on family and food than on formal prayer. Not everywhere, not completely, but enough that the meaning of Thanksgiving becomes something each household defines. Gratitude stays, but it becomes more personal, less proclaimed by governors and more practiced at tables. You can also feel how politics will keep touching it. A national holiday is never purely neutral. It becomes a symbol of unity, and unity is always being negotiated. Thanksgiving will be used to encourage national togetherness in times of division. It will be invoked in speeches. It will become part of how the nation tells itself who it is, sometimes sincerely, sometimes conveniently. Historians still argue whether Thanksgiving's nationalization primarily strengthened a shared civic identity or primarily reinforced a selective narrative that marginalized uncomfortable truths. The honest answer is, it did both. You felt both already. The warmth is real. The omissions are real. The day can comfort and conceal at the same time. Joke number 2, softly, you realize Thanksgiving is basically a family photo. Everyone smiles, everyone looks nice, and there are always things just outside the frame. Now, you start to feel the room itself thinning into memory. The fire is lower, the house is quieter. The rhythm of daily life has returned. People are thinking about tomorrow's work, not today's feast. And yet, something has changed. The day has left an imprint, not because it was perfect, but because it was shared. You notice small details that hint at tradition solidifying. A particular prayer that gets repeated. A particular dish someone insists must be made next year. A story that gets told again already, as if practicing for future Thanksgivings. That's how rituals form. They repeat until they feel inevitable. And you, sitting in 1826, can almost feel the future version of Thanksgiving drifting closer. You can sense the day becoming an anchor for travel, for family reunions, for annual expectation. You can sense it becoming a national pause before winter deepens. You can sense it becoming something that eventually carries parades, football, shopping madness, and all the loud modern layers you associate with it. But at its core, the seed is here. People gathering because the year was hard and they want to mark the fact that they made it. Joke number 3. You think about modern Thanksgiving traffic and realize the only thing that's really changed is the speed at which you suffer. The fire crackles one last time, and the room settles into a hush that feels almost like a lullaby. You let your thoughts slow, the way the house slows, the way the season demands. You remember the smell of wood smoke, the taste of molasses sweetness, the roughness of wool against your skin, the sound of laughter in a candlelit room, the quiet labor behind the feast, the complicated history under the myth. You hold it all without needing to force it into one clean moral. Because this is what Thanksgiving was really like 200 years ago. Not one story, but many. Not one menu, but a landscape of foods. Not one meaning, but a tangle of gratitude, survival, community, hierarchy, and hope. A holiday in motion, still becoming itself. And now, as you feel the warmth of the hearth fade into the soft darkness of bedtime, you let the farmhouse blur gently at the edges. The voices become quieter. The fire becomes a sleepy glow. The cold outside becomes less threatening and more distant, like a sound behind a wall. Your breathing slows. Your body settles. You're safe in the calm, held by the rhythm of the past, held by the simple idea that even in a harder world, people still found ways to gather, to eat, to laugh softly, and to say, in their own imperfect way, thank you. End of script. Sweet dreams.